He told himself he wasn't watching her. That was the first lie of the night. Grant Halberd had survived ambushes in 3 countries, kept his breathing steady while bullets tore through the dark 6 inches from his head, and learned long ago that the body doesn't lie not about danger and not about desire. So when his chest tightened the moment she stepped onto the terrace, when every nerve in him sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with the fact that she was her, he knew exactly what was happening. He just had no intention of doing anything about it. She was 30 years old, a CEO worth more than most small nations, and she was standing at his ex-wife's wedding reception, looking like she owned the air around her. Grant Halberd was a single father who drove a 7-year-old truck and kept leftover pasta in the fridge 6 days out of 7. So no, he wasn't watching her. That was the lie he told himself. And then she turned, looked directly at him across 20 feet of summer evening, and said nothing at all, and the lie became impossible to maintain. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing how far these stories travel. Now stay with me because this one goes somewhere you won't expect. The wedding was held at the Wentmore Estate, 40 minutes outside the city, on a Saturday in late June that had the kind of weather that makes people believe the world is fundamentally good. The grounds were immaculate white tents, string lights not yet lit because the sun hadn't finished with the sky, round tables dressed in ivory linen with arrangements that probably cost more per centerpiece than Grant made in a day. He had agreed to come for one reason, Sadie. His daughter was 8 years old and she loved Mallory. She had always loved Mallory, even through the divorce, even through the years of strained phone calls and custody logistics, and the particular kind of adult sadness that children absorb into their bodies without knowing what to call it. Mallory had been patient with Sadie in ways she hadn't always been patient with Grant, and he was willing to acknowledge that. So when Mallory called 3 months before the wedding and asked, carefully, whether he thought Sadie might want to be a junior bridesmaid, Grant had said yes without hesitation. What he hadn't anticipated was being asked to attend himself. She wants you there, his sister Dana had told him, with the tone she used when she thought he was about to make a foolish decision. Sadie, I mean. She'll be nervous up at the front and she wants to look out and see your face. He couldn't argue with that. He never could when it came to Sadie. So he put on the charcoal suit he'd bought for a colleague's funeral 2 years prior and driven to the Wentmore estate and sat in the 3rd row on the groom's side because that felt like the most neutral. Possible position not too close, not conspicuously far. He watched Sadie walk down the aisle holding a small basket of rose petals, her expression one of concentrated seriousness that made his chest ache with love and something close to laughter, because she was the most earnest child he had ever known, and she took every responsibility offered to her, like it was a matter of national importance. She spotted him in the 3rd row, and her face broke into the smile she reserved only for him, wide, unguarded, slightly crooked on the left side. He smiled back. That was enough. That was the whole reason he was there, compressed into 4 seconds of eye contact across a flower-draped aisle. The ceremony itself was fine. Mallory was beautiful. The groom, a soft-spoken architect named Patrick, who Grant had met twice and found genuinely decent, looked at her the way Grant had stopped being able to, somewhere around year 4 of their marriage. Grant watched that look and felt something that wasn't quite envy and wasn't quite grief. More like recognition. That's what it's supposed to look like. He had loved Mallory. He still did, in the dull and complicated way you love someone you built years with, even after those years had stopped working. He just wasn't the right person for her, and she wasn't the right person for him. It had taken them both too long to understand that, and the damage done in the delay had left marks on both of them that hadn't entirely faded. He drank sparkling water at the cocktail hour and made conversation with Patrick's uncle, a retired civil engineer from Pittsburgh who had strong opinions about bridge maintenance and was thrilled to share them. Grant listened attentively. It was easier than navigating the other conversations, the ones that began with, "So you're the ex-husband," and had nowhere comfortable to go from there. Sadie stayed close to Mallory through most of the cocktail hour, carrying out her junior bridesmaid duties with the gravity of a diplomat, and Grant watched from a comfortable distance and let her have that. She needed room to be her own person at events like this. He had learned that the hard way, early on his instinct to hover, to position himself near her at all times, was rooted more in his own anxiety than in any genuine need of hers. Sadie was more capable than he sometimes let himself believe. It was somewhere between the cocktail hour and the dinner seating that Grant drifted to the outer edge of the reception tent, and then, without particularly meaning to, out onto a stone terrace that ran along the back of the estate. The sun had dropped below the tree line by then, leaving the sky in that indeterminate state between gold and purple, the kind of light that flatters everything it touches. Grant stood at the stone railing and breathed for a moment without anyone talking at him, and it was almost enough to make the suit worthwhile. He heard heels on the stone behind him. He didn't turn immediately. Old habit, he registered the sound, catalogued it as non-threatening, continued what he was doing. "They run out of champagne in there?" a woman's voice said. Low, precise, not hostile but not performing warmth either. Just a direct question, as though she genuinely wanted to know. Grant turned. Later, he would not be able to explain his reaction coherently, which itself told him something. He was not a man prone to incoherence. He had been trained specifically to remain articulate and deliberate under conditions that reduced most people to pure reflex. But when he turned and saw Cassandra Wycliffe standing 6 feet away in a dress the color of deep water, not blue exactly, not green, something in between, with her dark hair pinned up in a way that looked like it had required 15 minutes of effort to appear effortless, and her expression carrying the particular fatigue of someone who had been performing composure all evening and was finally allowing themselves a moment off. When he saw all of that simultaneously, something in his chest did a thing it hadn't done in a very long time. He kept his face neutral, years of practice. "Champagne gives me a headache," he said. I was avoiding preventable suffering. One corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile yet. Reasonable strategy. She moved to the railing, leaving comfortable space between them, and looked out at the tree line. She was holding a champagne flute still half full, and she turned it slowly in her fingers, without drinking from it. Grant had seen Cassandra Wycliffe's photograph before. It was difficult not to, if you paid any attention to business news, which he did selectively. She had appeared on several magazine covers in the past 2 years, not because she sought the attention, from what he could gather, but because her company, Vantage Systems, had developed a data infrastructure platform that had fundamentally changed how mid-sized companies handled their security architecture, and the business press had decided she was the story. She was 30 years old. She had started Vantage at 24 in a one-room office with 2 engineers she'd recruited out of graduate school. The company was now valued at somewhere north of $2 billion. The photographs had not done a particularly accurate job. "You were in the 3rd row," she said, still looking at the trees. He glanced at her. "You noticed? You were the only person in the 3rd row who wasn't crying or pretending not to cry." She took a small sip of champagne. It stood out. "The little girl with the flower basket," Grant said. "She's mine." She was nervous. I was anchoring. Cassandra turned her head to look at him then, properly, for the first time. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the low light, and they had the quality of someone who was genuinely assessing what she was looking at, rather than simply waiting to respond. "That's a good word for it," she said. "Anchoring? Being present in a way someone can find without making it about you." Grant looked at her for a moment. "That's a very specific thing to observe about a stranger." "I'm good at observation," she said simply. "Not as a boast. As a fact." "So am I," he said. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens between people who are both accustomed to not filling space unnecessarily. "You're not enjoying yourself," Grant said. She turned the champagne glass again. "Is it that obvious? No, I'm just good at observation." That earned the actual smile, brief but real. It changed her face considerably. "Cassandra Wycliffe," she said. "Grant Halberd." They didn't shake hands. It didn't feel necessary. "How do you know the couple?" she asked. "I was married to the bride." He said it evenly, without the performance of casualness that people sometimes put on the sentence to demonstrate how unbothered they were. He was unbothered, mostly. There was no need to signal it. Cassandra absorbed this without visible reaction. "That's a particular kind of generosity," she said, after a moment. "Coming to the wedding, my daughter was in it. Still." She looked back at the trees. "A lot of people would have found a reason not to. A lot of people let their own discomfort take priority over what their kids need." She was quiet for a moment. Then yes, they do. There was something in the way she said it, not just agreement, but recognition. Like she was speaking from some specific stored knowledge of that particular disappointment. Grant didn't ask about it. He filed it. The string lights came on across the terrace, and the reception tent simultaneously timed to the darkening sky, and the grounds transformed in an instant from elegant to genuinely lovely. Cassandra looked up at the lights, and something in her expression eased slightly, like a muscle releasing tension it had been holding for hours. "Your dress," Grant said. She looked at him, waiting. "It's beautiful." She held his gaze for a moment, studied him. The way she studied things directly, unhurriedly, without the social performance of looking away and looking back. "You didn't mean the dress," she said. Grant felt something shift in his chest. He kept his expression steady. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The reception sounds drifted out from inside laughter, the clink of glassware, the band beginning to tune. Out here, the air was cooler, and the evening was pulling the warmth down from the sky, and it occurred to Grant that he hadn't felt this still, this genuinely, uncomplicatedly present, in longer than he could remember. He was about to say something. He wasn't entirely sure what. Something honest, which was rare enough for him in situations like this that it felt significant. And then his attention caught. It was the terrace doors, the ones that led back into the main reception room. Through the glass, partially obscured by a pillar, a man stood watching. Not watching the reception, not watching the dance floor or the bar or the tables where guests were finding their seats for dinner. Watching the terrace, watching Cassandra. Grant registered the man's posture in the time it took him to complete one breath. The stillness was wrong. Guests moved, mingled, gestured. This man was static in the way that people are only static when they're focused on something specific. His clothing was appropriate jacket, collared shirt, but he was positioned at an angle that kept his partially shadowed, and his eyes hadn't moved since Grant first noticed him. Grant did not change his expression. He did not look away from Cassandra or shift his posture or do anything to signal what he'd observed. This too was training the body that broadcasts its awareness gives away the advantage. "Can I ask you something?" he said, as though the conversation had simply continued. "You can try," she said. "How long have you been here tonight?" She frowned slightly at the question. "Since 6, why?" "Did you come alone or with staff?" Now the frown deepened. "I came with 2 members of my security team. They're inside." "Grant, don't turn around," he said quietly. Not urgently, but with enough precision that she went still. She was looking at him now, reading his face. And whatever she found there, the shift in his eyes, the calibration of his attention, told her enough to keep her from dismissing what he'd said. "There's a man inside," he said, "near the pillar to the left of the doors. He's been watching you since at least the time I turned around." Probably longer. Cassandra's jaw tightened. She kept looking at Grant, not at the doors. "Watching me. The way someone watches a target," he said. "Not the way someone watches a person they find attractive. Different posture. Different eye movement. How do you know the difference?" He looked at her steadily. "I know." A silence. She processed this. "Can you describe him?" Late 40s, early 50s. Dark jacket, light shirt, no tie, sandy hair going gray. He's positioned to watch without being watched. He's had practice at it. Cassandra's fingers had tightened around the champagne flute. She kept her posture relaxed with visible effort. "My team is inside." "I know. I'm going to step back toward the doors in about 45 seconds, slowly, conversationally, and get a better look at his position relative to your team. If you could laugh at something in about 15 seconds, that would be helpful. Give the impression this is just a pleasant conversation." She blinked. "You want me to. It keeps the scene normal." She stared at him for a fraction of a second longer. Then she laughed. Not a performance laugh, but the quiet, genuine kind, as though he'd said something wry and unexpected, which in its way he had. Grant smiled in return, and turned casually, and walked back toward the terrace doors with the unhurried gait of a man who simply wanted to refresh his drink. By the time he reached the doors, the man near the pillar was gone. Grant's eyes moved across the room in a single practice sweep. There, making his way through the crowd toward the main exit, keeping his pace measured. Grant watched him until he disappeared through the far door. He turned back to the terrace. Cassandra was still at the railing. She was looking out at the trees again, and her champagne glass was finally empty, and she was standing with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard to look like nothing had just changed. Grant returned to the railing, stood beside her. "Gone?" she asked very quietly. "Yes." She breathed out once slowly. "My team didn't notice. People miss things in crowds. It's not a criticism, it's a fact." She was quiet for a moment. "Who are you?" Grant looked at the tree line. Currently, a divorced father of one, attending his ex-wife's wedding because his daughter needed him there. And before currently, he was quiet for one beat. 2. Someone who learned to pay attention, he said. Cassandra turned to look at him then, profiled a full face, and the expression she wore was one he wouldn't be able to categorize precisely until much later, not surprise, not wariness. Something closer to recognition, like she had expected the evening to be one unremarkable thing, and had found, unexpectedly, that it was something else entirely. Cassandra. Sadie's voice came from behind them, piping, earnest, slightly out of breath from navigating the crowd inside. She skidded slightly on the stone terrace, steadied herself, and looked between Grant and Cassandra with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she's not evaluating the situation. Grant turned. "Hey, Bug, you done with your bridesmaid duties?" Mostly. Sadie's eyes were still on Cassandra. "You're very tall," she said. "Sadie," Grant said. "It's okay," Cassandra said, and there was something different in her voice now, lighter, unguarded in a way it hadn't been with him. She crouched down to Sadie's level, which in heels required balance and commitment, and Sadie watched this maneuver with open interest. "I am pretty tall. Are you the one who carried the flower basket?" "Rose petals," Sadie said, with the weight of precision. "They were rose petals, not flowers. The flowers stay on the tables." "Of course, I apologize. Did you drop any?" Sadie considered this with visible seriousness. 3, but they were on the outside rows so nobody important saw. Grant watched his daughter negotiate this conversation and felt the complicated warmth that was always underneath everything else. When it came to Sadie, the love that had no bottom, sitting right next to the constant low-grade terror of trying to do right by her. Cassandra stood and looked at him, and the expression on her face was harder to read than anything she'd shown him yet. "You're anchoring," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Every day," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the string-lit dark. Sadie reached up and took Grant's hand in both of hers, because she was 8 and the evening was getting long and she'd fulfilled her responsibilities, and now she wanted her father. And Grant held her hand and kept his eyes on Cassandra, and the evening settled around the three of them in a way that none of them had planned, and none of them quite had words for. "It was good to meet you," Cassandra said. Professional again. The composure back in place. But something underneath it had shifted, and they both knew it. "You too," Grant said. She walked back through the terrace doors into the reception, and the crowd absorbed her, and Grant stood with his daughter's hand in his and watched the space where she'd been. "Who was that?" Sadie asked. "Someone interesting," Grant said. Sadie considered this. She laughed at something you said. "You usually have to try harder for that." Grant looked down at her. "That's not the compliment you think it is." "Yes, it is," Sadie said, and pulled him toward the doors, and the evening closed around them, and the man who had been watching from the shadows was gone for now, and the lights strung overhead burned against the dark like small, stubborn fires. And Grant Halberd, who had not been watching, had seen everything. 6 weeks passed before he saw her again, and Grant spent most of those 6 weeks telling himself that was fine. It was fine. He had Sadie's school schedule and a maritime security contract that required 3 days in Baltimore reviewing vessel documentation. And Dana kept asking him to fix the gutters on her house in a way that suggested she would keep asking indefinitely until he did it. And there was genuinely no room in the architecture of his daily life for whatever that terrace conversation had been. He filed it the way he filed other things he couldn't act on cleanly in a clearly labeled compartment with the lid pressed shut. He did, however, look up Cassandra Wycliffe one evening after Sadie was in bed. Just professionally. The way you look up anyone whose situation has raised a security concern. That was entirely reasonable. He read 2 profile pieces, a Forbes interview from 8 months prior, and a brief item from a tech industry newsletter noting that Vantage Systems had announced a pending acquisition of a smaller competitor called Meridian Analytics, pending regulatory review. The deal was valued at somewhere around $400 million. Cassandra was quoted saying, "The acquisition would allow Vantage to offer clients an end-to-end security architecture that no competitor in their market segment could match." She sounded confident. She sounded like someone who had thought about this for a long time and was not interested in being second-guessed. He closed the browser and went to bed and did not look her up again. He also, when the Baltimore contract brought him into contact with two colleagues who worked in corporate protection, asked a few questions of a general nature about the current threat landscape for executives in the technology sector. His colleagues found this mildly interesting. Grant gave them no particular reason to find it more than mildly interesting, and the conversation moved on, and he filed their answers in the same compartment as everything else. The lid pressed down. Fine. The university lecture was on a Wednesday evening in early August, an event sponsored by the Hartwell Business Institute, featuring 3 executives on a panel about infrastructure and innovation. Grant attended because one of the panelists was a former client, a logistics CEO named Bernard Trask, who had hired Grant's firm 2 years prior during a period when some aggressively unhappy former partners had made threats that required taking seriously. The threat had resolved without incident. Bernard had sent a bottle of very good scotch by way of thanks, and they had maintained the loose, functional friendship of 2 people who had been in a pressurized situation together and had come out of it without either of them doing anything they were ashamed of. Bernard had emailed a week before, mentioned the panel, said Grant should come if he had nothing better to do. Grant had nothing better to do on Wednesday evenings. Sadie was with Mallory on Wednesdays now, a recent adjustment to the custody arrangement that Grant was still quietly calibrating to, filling the hours with work or the kind of low-grade home maintenance that he'd been deferring since the divorce. He arrived at the Hartwell Auditorium 10 minutes early, found a seat in the middle section, and was looking at the program when he registered movement to his left and turned by reflex, and Cassandra Wycliffe sat down 2 seats away, separated from him by an empty chair, shrugging off a light jacket and tucking it under her seat with the efficient movements of someone who does not enjoy being encumbered. She looked up and saw him, and for exactly 1 second something crossed her face that she then put away. "Maritime security professional," she said. "Technology panel attendee," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. "One of the panelists is a former client," he said. "One of the panelists is a former professor," she said. "He was insufferable in the classroom, and I'm told he's gotten worse. But he wrote a recommendation letter that I suspect changed the trajectory of my entire professional life. So I feel some obligation to show up when he speaks." She paused. "You didn't think I'd be here." "I didn't think about it," Grant said, with the straightness of someone who has had years of practice maintaining a position under questioning. She looked at him with the calm assessment of someone who does not believe everything she hears, but has decided not to make a point of it. "How's your daughter?" "She's with her mother tonight." "She's good. She corrected her teacher last week on the difference between a peninsula and an isthmus and has been quietly satisfied about it ever since." Cassandra's mouth moved. "She sounds very much like herself." "She really is." The moderator called the room to attention, and the panel began, and for the next 90 minutes, Grant watched Bernard Trask hold court on the subject of supply chain infrastructure with the comfortable authority of a man who has been in the room long enough to stop pretending he's deferring to anyone. Cassandra's former professor was indeed somewhat insufferable. The third panelist, a woman from a civil engineering firm, was the most technically precise of the 3, and also the least listened to, which Grant found predictable and irritating. He was aware the entire time of Cassandra 2 seats to his left. She watched the panel with complete attention, arms folded, occasionally writing something in a small notebook she'd produced from her bag. Once, the professor said something Grant suspected was technically inaccurate, and he saw her jaw tighten slightly, and her pen stop moving for a moment before she resumed. She did not sigh or shift or telegraph her disagreement with her body. She just stored it. Afterward, in the loose milling around that follows these events, Grant found Bernard and shook hands and made 10 minutes of conversation, and when he turned around, Cassandra was 15 feet away, talking to the engineering panelist, the one nobody had listened to, with an attentiveness that looked genuine rather than performative. She was nodding, asking questions. The engineer's posture, which had been slightly contracted during the panel, had opened up. Bernard followed Grant's gaze. "You know Cassandra Wycliffe?" We've met, Grant said. Bernard made a sound of mild interest. Sharp. Seriously, sharp. I tried to get Vantage's product suite into our logistics infrastructure 18 months ago, and she personally sat across the table from me and took my operation apart in about 20 minutes. Found 3 vulnerabilities I didn't know I had. It was uncomfortable and extremely impressive. He paused. She also walked away from the deal because she didn't think our security culture was at the right level to implement what she was selling, which cost her a significant contract. Grant looked at him. She walked away from the money. Said she'd rather have no client than a client who would make her system look bad through their own negligence. Bernard picked up his drink. I respected the hell out of it, personally. Didn't enjoy it in the moment. Cassandra, across the room, said something that made the engineer laugh. Grant excused himself from Bernard. He drifted toward the exit, collecting his jacket from the coat check, and was outside on the front steps, working out whether he wanted to walk to the parking structure or take the longer way around that went past the better coffee cart he'd noticed on the way in, when he heard heels on the stone steps behind him. The coffee here is terrible, Cassandra said. There's a place 2 blocks east that's open until 10. Grant turned. She was standing 3 steps above him, jacket back on, bag over her shoulder, with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see if it's going to be a problem. I know, he said. I was already planning to walk that direction. She came down the steps. They walked. The coffee place was narrow and bright, with the kind of irregular hours and indifferent decor that usually means the product is serious. They ordered. She took her coffee with nothing in it. He took his with a small amount of milk, which she observed but did not comment on, and found a table near the window, with the ease of 2 people who have spent enough time being efficient that they have largely stopped overthinking where to sit. The conversation started where practical conversations start, the panel. Grant's assessment of the insufferable professor. Her defense of him qualified, careful, making clear she knew exactly what he was, and still felt what she felt about the letter he'd written. Her work on the Meridian acquisition. His work in maritime security, which he described accurately if selectively, in the way that people with operational backgrounds learn to describe their work to civilians without misrepresenting it, or going further than the other person actually wants to follow. And then the conversation stopped being practical and became something else, the way conversations sometimes do when both people are tired of performing, and the hour is late enough to permit honesty. What happened after the wedding? She said. Not dramatically. Just directly, the way she did most things. Grant wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. What do you mean? The man you noticed. Watching me. He had not forgotten. He had been waiting to see whether she would bring it up, or had decided to file it the same way. He filed out things in a labeled compartment, lid down. The fact that she was asking told him something. I lost him when he moved toward the main exit. I didn't have cause to follow him, and it wasn't my event. I wasn't there in a professional capacity, but you thought about it afterward. He met her eyes. Yes, she turned her cup in her hands, the same gesture she'd made with the champagne flute on the terrace. Something she did when she was thinking. I've been receiving messages, she said. On my private phone. Not my work line, my personal number. The number that maybe 30 people have. Grant went still in the way he'd learned to go still. All attention present, nothing signaled outward. What kind of messages? Texts, no name. They reference things about my schedule, places I've been, events I've attended. The first one came 3 weeks before the wedding. She paused. I initially thought it was someone trying to pitch me something. Some people get creative about access. I ignored it. She looked out the window. Then one came the night of the wedding, about 30 minutes before you and I spoke on the terrace. He breathed in slowly. What did it say? It said you should be more careful about who you trust. She delivered this flatly, without performance. And then a photograph of me at a dinner I'd attended 4 days prior. It was taken from outside the restaurant, through the window. Grant was quiet for a moment. He was running calculations he'd done versions of many times before, in context far removed from this coffee shop, triangulating the effort required, the access implied, the likely objective. You told your security team, he said. I told my head of security. Marcus, he took it seriously. He looked into it, a pause. He didn't find anything that gave him a clear threat to respond to. That's not the same as there being no threat. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. Outside, the street was emptying into late evening quiet. A couple walked past the window, the woman saying something that made the man duck his head to laugh. Normal, uncomplicated. Grant watched them for a second. "The man at the wedding," he said. "Can you think of anyone you recognize there? A name associated with a business interest, a negotiation? Anyone in the Meridian deal?" She was quiet for longer than he expected. That itself was an answer. "There's a man named Russell Kincaid," she said carefully. "Senior VP of Strategic Development at Vantage. He's been with the company for 6 years. She stopped, started again. He has a seat at the table for everything related to the acquisition. He's one of 3 people who have access to the data room where all the Meridian deal documents live. And in the past month, Meridian's lead counsel has referenced details in 2 of our conversations that he should not have had access to. Small things. Things that would only make sense if someone inside Vantage was communicating our internal position." She said it with the careful control of someone who has been sitting on a conclusion that frightens them. "I don't have proof. I have a pattern that I cannot explain any other way." Grant looked at her. She was holding herself very straight. Her coffee was untouched and had been for several minutes. "Russell was at Mallory's wedding?" he said. "Patrick the groom, his firm did the architectural work on Russell's house renovation 2 years ago. They know each other." She paused. "I didn't know Russell would be there until I saw him across the room. I thought it was a coincidence. I told myself it was a coincidence." "Was he the man on the terrace?" No, she was certain. "No, Russell is taller, thinner. The man you described, that's not Russell." She frowned. "Which means if it's related to Russell, it's someone he sent." Grant sat with this for a moment, organizing it. The shape of it was recognizable. He had seen versions of this before, not in corporate boardrooms, but the underlying architecture was the same. Someone with access and an objective, applying pressure through proxies and information, trying to create conditions that would force a target into a specific position. "Have there been more messages since the wedding?" he said. 2. "Saying what?" She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone and slid it across the table without speaking. He read both messages. The first had come 10 days after the wedding. "The people you think are protecting you are the ones you should be watching." The second, 3 days ago, "Vantage would be stronger with different leadership." Some people already understand this. He slid the phone back. "You're not going to the police." "With what?" "Anonymous texts and a suspicion about a colleague I can't prove." Her jaw was tight. "Marcus thinks I should wait for something more concrete." "Marcus is thinking about his liability," Grant said. She looked at him sharply. "That's not fair. It might not be fair." "It's probably accurate." He leaned forward slightly. "Cassandra, whoever this is, they're not escalating toward a crime of passion. This is methodical. The messages, the surveillance at the wedding, the information leak, this is someone running a campaign. The end goal isn't to scare you. It's to maneuver you into a position where you make a decision that benefits them." He paused. "The most likely desired outcome, given the acquisition timeline, is that you feel unsafe enough or compromised enough that you withdraw from leading the deal. Or the company." She was very still. "I know," she said. And I'm not going to do that." He looked at her. She said it the way someone states a fact about geography, not defiantly, not as a performance of courage, just as an established feature of reality that she had no intention of renegotiating. "Then you need to be smarter about your patterns," he said. "Not because you're in immediate physical danger. I don't think that's what this is yet. But whoever is watching you needs information. They need to know your schedule, your associations, your routines. The more predictable you are, the more useful you are to them." She listened, not with the wariness of someone being told what to do and preparing to push back with the focus of someone taking notes on something technically important. He talked for a while, about varying routes, about the difference between security that looks thorough and security that actually is, about which routine behaviors create the most exploitable patterns and how to disrupt them without making the disruption itself a signal. He had had versions of this conversation with clients before, but those had been professional transactions with clear parameters. This felt different, in ways he was not entirely comfortable examining. "Your phone," he said at one point. "What about it?" "Can Marcus audit who has the number?" "Actually audit, not just ask around." "He can. Tell him to. And change the number. Don't announce it broadly, just route the old number to an answering service and distribute the new one only to people you can account for one by one. He paused. It won't stop the messages. If they have other access to your schedule, they have other methods. But it reduces the information they're collecting about how you respond. She nodded slowly. You said you weren't there in a professional capacity. I wasn't. Are you now? He looked at her. No. She held his gaze for a moment. Then why are you doing this? He thought about the honest answer. He thought about the clean, professional answer. He thought about the various answers available to him and their respective risks and implications. And then he decided that she had been honest with him, and that seemed like it deserved something close to equivalent. Because I noticed someone watching you before you knew to worry about it, he said. And I don't do particularly well with leaving things unfinished. She was quiet. Then that's a very careful answer. It's an accurate one. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes that missed less than most people's gazes did. And Grant held the look without flinching because he had nothing to hide in it, not exactly, only things he had decided not to say yet. All right, she said, and picked up her coffee, and the conversation moved into different territory. They stayed until the coffee shop closed at 10. The walk back to their respective parking structures took them in the same direction for 4 blocks, and then in different directions. And they stood for a moment at the corner where the routes diverged. How long have you been in maritime security? She asked. 6 years. And before that, he'd known the question was coming. He'd been feeling it building for the last half hour, the way you feel a change in pressure before weather arrives. Military, he said. How long? 12 years. She looked at him steadily. Navy, he looked back. Yes, she nodded, not pushing. Not pretending she hadn't heard what lived in the economy of that exchange. Thank you for the coffee conversation, she said. Thank you for telling me. She walked away. He watched her go for a moment, not because she looked beautiful in the light, though she did, but because watching someone move through a public space had become an involuntary professional assessment for him, and she moved well. Alert without performing alertness. Aware of the street without advertising her awareness. He walked to his car. He drove home. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it was always quiet. When Sadie was at Mallory's, not just silent, but dimensionally different. A smaller space, somehow. He made a cup of tea he didn't want and stood at the kitchen counter and turned over the shape of what he'd just heard. Russell Kincaid. A $400 million acquisition. Anonymous surveillance. A pattern of pressure designed to move a person toward a predetermined outcome. And Cassandra Wycliffe, who had looked him in the eye and said, I'm not going to do that the way someone states a law of physics. He poured the tea down the sink and went to bed. Over the following weeks, the shape of something new assembled itself with the unhurried logic of things that are going to happen, regardless of whether anyone is ready for them. It didn't announce itself. It arrived the way most significant things do in small increments, in the texture of ordinary days. They met for dinner on a Tuesday, ostensibly because Cassandra had a question about physical security protocol for an off-site executive retreat she was planning, and Grant had agreed to consult informally. And that was true, and also not the whole truth, and they were both aware of this and did not address it. The restaurant was a mid-range Italian place she'd suggested, with cramped tables and a wine list that was overlong for its ambitions. And they talked about the retreat for 20 minutes and then talked about other things for another 2 hours. She had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Her mother was a high school chemistry teacher. Her father had left when she was 11, and she spoke of this without apparent wound, in the same tone she used for facts out market conditions or building codes, not because the wound didn't exist, Grant suspected, but because it had been so thoroughly incorporated into the structure of who she was that it no longer registered as separate from her. She had started her first business at 19, selling refurbished electronics from her dorm room. It had not been successful. She had learned from it and started another one at 21, and that one had not been successful either. She had found this educational rather than discouraging, which told Grant something about the fundamental organization of her nervous system. He told her about growing up in western Pennsylvania, about the specific quality of wanting to leave a place without being able to articulate exactly what you wanted to leave for. He told her about enlisting at 18 and what it had felt like to discover that he was very good at something demanding, that the combination of physical ability, spatial reasoning, and emotional regulation that had made him an odd fit in civilian life had turned out to be precisely what certain kinds of military work required. He did not tell her specific operational details, because some of that was classified, and the rest of it was simply not for general distribution, but he gave her the shape of it, honestly. He did not talk about the marriage much. She did not push. "Do you miss it?" she asked once. The military work. He thought about it genuinely. Parts of it. The clarity. When you're in an operation, you know what success looks like. The rest of your life never quite tells you that. What does success look like now? He thought about Sadie waking up every morning in a house that was stable. Thought about her correcting her teacher on peninsulas and isthmuses with that quiet confidence that was entirely her own. Different things, he said. Smaller things. But the smaller things add up. She nodded. She seemed to understand this. They discovered gradually that they argued well. Not in the way of two people performing the friction of differing views, but in the genuine, focused way of two people who have thought carefully about things, and have different conclusions, and are interested in understanding the gap. Cassandra had strong positions on economic development policy and expressed them with the precision of someone who has spent real time with the data. Grant pushed back on two of her assumptions, with cause, and she revised one position on the spot and maintained the other with evidence he had to acknowledge was solid. He found this, against all expectation, extremely enjoyable. He also found himself, in the evenings when Sadie was at Mallory's, doing something he had not done since before the divorce, looking forward to specific days. Sadie met Cassandra for the second time on a Saturday afternoon at the end of August, when Grant had brought Sadie to a farmer's market near the Arts District, and they had run into Cassandra outside a coffee stand with the inevitability of two people whose orbits have started to overlap. Sadie had looked at Cassandra with the frank, measuring gaze she turned on all new information, and then had asked her, without preamble, whether she thought the difference between a CEO and a president of a company was mainly about governance structure or mostly a title thing. Cassandra had crouched down again, in heels, with the same calm balance, and had given Sadie a genuinely thoughtful answer that lasted about 3 minutes, and touched on fiduciary responsibility and board dynamics in terms precise enough to be accurate and simple enough to be clear. Sadie had listened with absolute attention. Then she had said, "Okay. My dad says titles are mostly signaling and the work is where the actual information is." Cassandra had looked up at Grant. "Your dad is right about that." "He's right about a few things," Sadie said generously, and Grant had stood there in the August sunlight, watching his 8-year-old negotiate this conversation, and felt something he couldn't name, but recognized the warm, slightly alarming feeling of your life making room for something it hadn't contained before. The Meridian acquisition moved forward through September, with the grinding procedural difficulty that major corporate transactions always carry. Cassandra mentioned it in pieces, across different conversations, not as complaint, but as information Grant had learned that she did not really complain in the traditional sense. She reported, she analyzed, she made plans, the leak had continued. She was certain now. A third instance of Meridian's counsel, referencing internal vantage information, detailed enough this time that Cassandra had quietly changed the data room access protocols after speaking with her board counsel, without giving Russell Kincaid a direct reason for the change. She was building a record. "You're doing this methodically," Grant said. They were walking along the river on a Saturday evening, the kind of walk that had started as a practical meeting and became something else by the third block. "I can't go to the board with a suspicion," she said. "I can go to the board with a pattern. What does the pattern currently show?" 3 documented information disclosures. A timestamp analysis of data room access logs that puts Russell in the system immediately before each disclosure. No definitive proof of transmission, but a correlation strong enough that my outside counsel thinks it's worth pursuing. "You've already talked to outside counsel. 2 weeks ago." She glanced at him. "I've been building the case in parallel while managing the acquisition." "It's not comfortable." "No," he said, "I imagine it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. The river moved alongside them, dark and indifferent. "He's been with the company since we had 11 employees," she said. "He was in the room when we closed our Series A. He gave a toast at our 5-year anniversary dinner." She paused. "I trusted him." Grant did not say anything immediately because there was nothing to say immediately that wouldn't flatten what that actually cost. He just walked beside her, and after a moment she continued. I keep trying to find an alternative explanation. I've spent a lot of time on this. That's not irrational, Grant said. That's due diligence. At some point, due diligence becomes avoidance. Yes, he said, it does. She nodded just once, accepting it. They had reached the point in the walk where a converted warehouse stood back from the river path. Behind a low iron fence as a large, three-story brick building with arched windows and the particular decay of a structure that has been empty long enough to acquire atmosphere. Cassandra stopped and looked at it. I'm trying to acquire that building, she said. He looked at it. For vantage, no. Personal project. I want to turn it into a community education center. Coding programs for kids, adult workforce development, some makerspace. She kept looking at it. It's been empty for 11 years. The estate that owns it has been trying to settle an inheritance dispute, and nobody's been able to move on the building. My lawyer thinks there's a path to resolution in the next year. Grant looked at the building. In the evening light, the brick had a warmth to it that it probably didn't have in daylight. The arched windows were intact, no boards, just grime. The bones were good. That's a significant project, he said. Everything I do is a significant project, she said, and there was a dryness to it that was as close to self-deprecating humor as she got, and he found it more appealing than most people's actual jokes. Can we go closer, he said. She looked at him, the fence. The gate latch is broken, he said. Third post from the left. She looked at the gate, then at him. You notice that from here? Force of habit. She considered this for a moment, and then she walked to the gate, and it opened exactly as he'd said, and they went in. The ground floor of the building could be accessed through a side door that had long since given up on its lock, and they went through it into the dim, enormous interior concrete floors, exposed timber ceiling beams, the smell of old brick and settled dust, and the specific quiet of a space that has been holding its breath for years. Cassandra walked into the center of it and turned slowly, looking upward at the beams, at the arched windows, at the particular geometry of the space. Grant watched her face. She was not performing wonder. She was genuinely assessing mapping what was there against what she imagined, calculating the distance between them. Her expression in that specific moment was the most unguarded he had seen it. The skylight is intact, she said, looking up at a large paned window set into the ceiling above the central space. It is, he said. There's more room than I thought. She turned again. The west wall could support a full mezzanine level. There's enough height. What would the mezzanine be? Library, reading space, quiet work area. She stopped turning and looked at him. You're humoring me. I'm genuinely interested, he said. She looked at him in that direct, measuring way, and then something in her expression shifted the assessment layer, thinned, and what was underneath it was simpler and harder to look at. He held the look because he had gotten good at that. Grant, she said quietly. Yeah, the space between them was 4 feet. Then 3. He put his hand up, and with the back of 2 fingers, he moved a piece of her hair that had come loose from its pin and was lying against her cheek. The touch lasted approximately 1 second. Her eyes stayed on his. Not yet, she whispered. He lowered his hand. Okay. He meant it. Completely. He had no interest in taking what wasn't freely given, not because of principle alone, but because whatever this was had been building with enough care that he wasn't willing to damage it for the sake of a moment. She breathed out slowly, looked up at the skylight again. Not yet doesn't mean no, she said. I know, he said. They stood in the quiet of the old building, in the amber dust of late evening coming through the dirty glass, and the moment arranged itself around them with the precision of something that had been heading here from a considerable distance. Grant turned to the window to give them both room to breathe and stopped. On the street beyond the iron fence, partly obscured by the angle of the gate, a dark SUV was parked with its engine running. He had seen a dark SUV twice before in the past 3 weeks. Once outside the restaurant on Tuesday, and once parked near the farmer's market in August. He had noted it. He had not been certain enough to act. He was more certain now. He said nothing to Cassandra immediately. He watched the vehicle through the arched window for 15 seconds, tracking the angle of the side mirror, determining the sightline. The sightline pointed directly at the gate they had come through. Whoever was in that vehicle knew exactly where they were. and they now knew that Grant Halberd, who had noticed the man at the wedding and had been spending time with Cassandra Wycliffe ever since, was not incidental to the picture. He turned back to her. She was still looking at the skylight, still in the particular privacy of her own plans. He didn't tell her yet. He filed it in a different compartment now, a more urgent one, with the lid that stayed open. There was work to do. He didn't tell her about the SUV that night. He told himself it was because he needed more than one confirmed sighting to present it as something other than pattern recognition that might be wrong, and that was true. But the other part of it, the part he was less comfortable examining, was that he had watched her face in that building while she mapped the skylight and the mezzanine and the west wall, and he had not wanted to take that moment away from her. She so rarely let herself have moments like that. The ones where the performance of competence dropped and something simpler showed through. He drove home that night with the SUV's partial plate number written on the inside of his wrist in ballpoint pen, the way he used to write things in the field when paper wasn't an option. Old muscle memory. He ran the partial through a contact at a private investigations firm he'd worked with twice before, a woman named Elaine Cho, who was meticulous, discreet, and charged accordingly. He gave her what he had. She said she'd see what she could find. Then he spent 3 days watching his own behavior to make sure he wasn't constructing a threat out of coincidence, because he had personal reasons to be invested in the situation. This was something his SEAL training had hammered into him. The brain finds what it's looking for, and wanting to protect someone is one of the most reliable ways to start seeing danger that isn't there. He ran the math again, carefully, the way he would have run an operational assessment: the man at the wedding, the messages, the information leak, the SUV appearing 3 times in proximity to Cassandra over 6 weeks. Each element individually was explainable. Together they formed a shape he had seen before, in other configurations, in other contexts. The shape of a coordinated operation. He decided he wasn't wrong. He called Cassandra on a Thursday afternoon. While she was between meetings, he'd learned her schedule well enough to know the narrow windows, and he told her about the SUV. He described all 3 sightings in sequence. He gave her the partial plate. He told her he had someone looking into it. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for him to hear her breathing change. "You saw it 3 weeks ago," she said. "Outside the restaurant." "Yes, and you didn't tell me. I wasn't certain enough. 1 sighting is noise. 2 is a pattern forming. 3 is a pattern." Another silence. He could feel her working through whether she was angry about this, and he let her work through it without trying to manage the outcome. "I'm not going to tell you that was the wrong call," she said finally. "I'm also not going to tell you it feels good. I know. Grant." Her voice had something in it that was not quite controlled. "I need you to tell me things when you see them, even if you're not certain. I can handle uncertainty. I work in it every day. What I can't handle is finding out you are managing my information for my own good." The sentence landed exactly where it was aimed. He recognized the impact. "That's fair," he said. "You're right. I know I'm right." A pause. Then, with less edge, "What's Elaine finding?" He was quiet for a second. "I didn't tell you about Elaine. You said you had someone looking into it. You work in maritime security. You have exactly 1 private investigator contact whose name comes up in industry circles. Her name is Elaine Cho, and she takes the kind of cases that require discretion." I did 30 seconds of inference. Another pause. "I'm good at this, Grant. Let me be good at it." He sat with that for a moment, and what he felt was something he hadn't felt in a long time in the vicinity of another adult, the specific, unfamiliar comfort of being known. Elaine traced the partial to a vehicle registered to a security consulting firm called Arbridge Associates, he said. "It's a small operation, 4 people, incorporated 8 months ago. The incorporation documents list a silent partner whose name is behind 2 layers of LLC structure. Elaine is still pulling on that thread. 8 months ago," Cassandra said. "Yes. The Meridian acquisition was announced internally 7 months ago." He didn't need to respond to that. They both heard it. "All right," she said. "Keep going. And Grant, from now on, you tell me when you see things. Whatever it is." "Yes," he said. He meant it this time with full understanding of what he was agreeing to. October moved through its weeks with the particular cold efficiency of a month that has no patience for sentimentality. The Meridian acquisition was moving toward its final regulatory review, which meant Cassandra's schedule compressed into something that looked from the outside like continuous motion board calls, legal reviews, integration planning sessions, a 2-day trip to the Meridian headquarters in Phoenix that Grant tracked from a distance and Elaine tracked more closely because the Arbridge vehicle had followed Cassandra to the airport and Elaine had photographed the driver. The driver was a former private investigator named Colin Stracer, who had lost his license in New Jersey 3 years prior following a complaint about illegal surveillance techniques. He was now apparently working for Arbridge Associates, which was apparently working for someone whose name was still behind 2 layers of LLC documentation that Elaine was systematically disassembling. Grant updated Cassandra on all of this in increments as the information arrived, because he had committed to that and because she had been right that she could handle it. She absorbed each piece with the focused calm of someone who is frightened but has decided that fear is a resource to be managed rather than a state to be expressed. She was sleeping badly. She told him this once, without framing it as a complaint, just as information, the way she told him everything. He was sleeping badly too, though he didn't say so. Sadie noticed something was different without being able to name it. She was a perceptive child in the way that children who have learned to read adult emotional atmospheres tend to be. The divorce had sharpened something in her that he both valued and felt quietly guilty about. One evening at dinner, she looked at him across the pasta and said, "You're thinking about something complicated." "I'm thinking about work," he said. "Work complicated or people complicated?" He looked at his 8-year-old. Both. She considered this with her fork. "Is it about Cassandra?" He put down his own fork. "Why would it be about Cassandra? Because when you talk about her, your voice does a different thing." Sadie said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting observed data. It's hard to describe. It's like the way your voice sounds when you're paying close attention to something. He looked at her for a moment. "That's a very specific observation." "I'm a specific person," she said, and went back to her pasta. He had no answer for that, and did not try to provide one. The Hartwell Group's annual Innovation Awards dinner was held on the second Friday of November at a hotel ballroom downtown. With the full complement of corporate performance that these events require roundtables for 10 over-engineered centerpieces, a cocktail hour that runs 20 minutes long because nobody has figured out how to start a room full of executives moving toward their seats. Cassandra attended as a presenter. Vantage Systems was sponsoring one of the evening's award categories, and Grant attended because Bernard Trask had a table and had asked him again, and because Elaine's most recent update had indicated that Strasser had been photographed outside Cassandra's office building 3 times in the past 2 weeks, and Grant had decided he was not going to be 30 minutes away on the night of a large public event that Cassandra's attendance at had been publicly listed on the Hartwell Group's website for 6 weeks. He did not tell Cassandra he would be there, not because he was managing her information. He had committed to not doing that, but because if he told her, she would think about him being there, and he wanted her attention on the room and not on him. He sat at Bernard's table and watched the room with the peripheral competence of someone who has been trained to maintain conversational presence while processing environmental data simultaneously. He tracked the exits. He tracked the staff movement patterns. He noted the 2 members of Cassandra's security team positioned near the stage entrance and assessed their positioning as adequate for an interior venue and inadequate for what came after. When the event ended and the crowd redistributed into the street and the parking structure, Cassandra presented the award at 8:40. She was composed and precise and completely in command of the room, the particular kind of public authority that doesn't require volume or performance, that comes from absolute certainty about what you're doing and why. Grant watched from the far side of the ballroom and thought about the woman in the warehouse looking at the skylight, and how both versions of her were real, and how most people only ever got to see one of them. After the presentations, during the dinner service, he sent her a text, "I'm at Bernard's table. Don't look. Just wanted you to know." She did not look. He respected this unreservedly. Her response came 4 minutes later. "We need to talk about the after-event parking situation. Marcus has the car in the east structure, 3rd level. I don't love the layout." He typed back, "I don't love it either. I'll be outside the east structure exit at 9:50. A pause. "Then you already looked at the layout?" "Yes." Another pause. "Thank you." He put the phone away and finished his dinner and talked to Bernard about the logistics industry and tried not to count the minutes. At 9:40, he excused himself from the table and went outside. The night was cold in the way that November evenings in this part of the country are cold not dramatically, just consistently, a temperature that has made its mind up and is not interested in negotiation. The hotel sat on a block that opened onto a riverside boulevard on its south side, and the east parking structure was accessed through a service alley that connected the hotel's rear exit to the structure's ground floor entrance. Grant stood at the mouth of the alley and looked at it. The alley was 70 feet long, lit at both ends, dark in the middle section where the overhead fixture had failed recently, from the look of it, because the fixture itself was intact and the bulb was simply out. That was the kind of detail that could be coincidence and could be preparation. He did not assume either. He noted it and adjusted for it. There was a vehicle parked at the alley's midpoint. Not the Arbridge SUV, a different vehicle, a dark sedan, angled slightly toward the wall in a way that was off by about 15 degrees from how someone parking casually would position it. Its engine was off. Its lights were off. Grant stood in the shadow of the hotel's exterior corner and watched it for 90 seconds and saw no movement inside. He texted Cassandra, "Change of plan. Come out through the main hotel entrance, not the rear exit. Tell Marcus to bring the car around to the front." Her response was immediate. "Why?" "Tell you in a minute. Main entrance." He moved away from the alley and positioned himself at the corner where the hotel's main entrance steps met the street, with a sightline to both the front of the building and the alley mouth 40 yards to his right. He called Marcus directly. Cassandra had given him the number 2 weeks ago, citing practicality in a tone that suggested she'd been thinking about it longer than 2 weeks. Marcus answered on the second ring. "It's Grant Halberd. There's a vehicle in the east alley that I don't like. I've asked Cassandra to exit through the main entrance. Can you bring the car around to the front drop-off?" A pause. Marcus was ex-law enforcement. Grant had assessed this early and correctly, and he processed operational information with professional speed. "I see it on the camera feed. I've been watching it for 10 minutes. Then why were you routing her through the alley?" A shorter pause. "I didn't think it was more than a bad park. It might not be. I'd rather be wrong about this." "Agreed." He heard Marcus in motion. "Give me 4 minutes." The hotel's main doors opened, and Cassandra came out with one of her security team members, close behind a large, quiet man named Derek, who Grant had seen twice before and assessed as competent and attentive. She was wearing a coat over her presentation clothes, and she moved with the brisk directness of someone who has been given information and is acting on it without requiring a full explanation first. She spotted Grant at the bottom of the steps. "What did you see?" she said when she reached him. "Sedan in the alley, wrong angle. Lights out, engine off, no visible occupant movement. Could be nothing, but we changed the route. So it costs us nothing if it's nothing." She nodded. Derek had positioned himself slightly behind and to her right, which was correct, and Grant registered this with the automatic approval of someone who evaluates protective positioning on instinct. Marcus brought the car around in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was better than 4. Cassandra and Derek got in. Marcus pulled into traffic. Grant stood on the hotel steps and watched the car's tail states until they merged with the boulevard's flow, and then he walked around to the east alley and stood at its entrance for a moment, looking at the sedan. It was still there, still angled wrong, still dark. He took out his phone and called Elaine. "I need a plate run." He read her the number. "Tonight, if possible. I'll call you back," she said. He went home. Elaine called back at 11:17. The sedan was registered to a rental company. The rental had been taken out under a corporate account linked to after 2 layers of tracing that Elaine did in 40 minutes because she was very good at her job, Arbridge Associates. He called Cassandra. She answered on the first ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping. "Arbridge rented the sedan," he said. "It was in the alley." Silence. "Cassandra, I'm here." Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something taut and tired, like a wire that has been under tension for too long. "They were at the hotel." "Yes. This is the 4th time they've been near me in a public setting." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Grant, I need to know your honest read." Not the careful version, the honest one. He sat down on the edge of his kitchen counter. He thought about giving her the measured assessment, the the one with the appropriate qualifiers and uncertainty ranges. He thought about what she'd asked him to do, back in October, and what he'd committed to. My honest read, he said, is that this has moved past the information gathering phase. The first month, the messages, the surveillance, the leak that was about building leverage and mapping your associations. This is different. Positioning a vehicle at a known exit route on an evening where your attendance was publicly listed is not surveillance. It's preparation. Preparation for what? Intimidation, most likely. Physical intimidation. Not violence, that's not the profile here. The whole operation has been carefully calibrated to stay below the level that brings law enforcement directly in. But enough of a confrontation to make you feel unsafe. To make you feel like the people around you can't protect you. He paused. The goal is still the same. They want you to pull back from the acquisition, or from leading the company through it. If they can make you feel vulnerable enough, exposed enough, they think you'll make a decision that benefits whoever is behind this. Russell, she said. Elaine is close to breaking through the last LLC layer, he said. Another few days. And until then, you change your routines. You don't attend public events whose locations have been listed online more than 48 hours in advance without a route change we planned the day before. You let Marcus know about this call tonight, and you let him update your protective protocols. And you don't go anywhere alone that isn't your office or your home. A pause. That sounds a lot like being managed. It sounds like not giving them another opportunity like the one they had tonight. She was quiet for a long moment. He could hear her in the silence, the working through, the resistance, the logic reasserting itself over the resistance. Okay, she said. How long? Until we know who we're dealing with. Then we figure out what comes next. All right. Another pause. Are you home? Yes, good. Her voice softened by a fraction, not much, barely audible, but he'd gotten good at her register. Thank you for being there tonight. I told you I'd tell you things when I see them. You were there before you saw anything. You went because you were worried. He didn't answer that, because she was correct and they both knew it, and denying it would have been an insult to them both. Get some sleep, he said. I'll try, she said, which was honest, which he appreciated. Elaine broke through the final LLC layer on a Tuesday morning, 11 days later, and called Grant while he was driving Sadie to school. I'll call you back in 15 minutes, he said. He dropped Sadie at the front entrance, watched her walk through the doors with her backpack and her expression of focused readiness for the day, and sat in the parking lot with the engine running and called Elaine back. The beneficial owner of Arbridge Associates, through 2 Delaware LLCs and a Nevada holding company, Elaine said, is a man named Theodore Marsh. He's a private equity manager who specializes in distressed technology acquisitions. He has a prior business relationship with Russell Kincaid. They co-invested in 2 deals in 2019 and 2020, both of which were profitable. Grant stared at the school's front entrance. Marsh has a financial position in Meridian Analytics, Elaine continued. He came in as a late-stage investor 18 months ago at a valuation significantly below the current acquisition price. If the Vantage deal closes, his return is substantial. If it doesn't close, or if it closes at a lower valuation, or if Cassandra Wycliffe is removed from the leadership of the deal, there are scenarios that benefit Marsh significantly more. How? Marsh has a side arrangement with a third party. I have documentation suggesting, not proving, that he's committed to deliver Meridian's core IP to a competitor at a price well below acquisition value if the Vantage deal falls through. The competitor pays him a success fee on top of the discounted price. It's structured to be invisible unless you're specifically looking for it. Grant was very quiet. He was calculating, not calculating. Just letting the shape of it fully assemble. So Russell leaks information to undermine the deal, Grant said slowly. The deal either collapses or Cassandra steps back. Marsh exercises his side arrangement, and everyone who arranged this walks away with money they couldn't have made if Cassandra Wycliffe had simply been allowed to do her job. That's the structure, Elaine said. I can't prove the side arrangement yet. It's 2 layers removed from anything I can access directly. But the Arbridge connection and the Marsh-Kincaid prior relationship are documentable. I have 12 pages. Send it to me. He read it in the parking lot. Then he called Cassandra. She listened to all of it without interrupting. He had learned that she did this. When information was serious, she went still and let it come in completely before she processed it aloud. When he finished, there was a pause. 12 pages, she said. With documents. Elaine's meticulous. I need to get this to my outside counsel today. She was already in motion. He could hear it in the precision of her voice, the shift into operational mode. And I need to talk to my board chair before Russell has any indication this is coming. Yes, Grant, this is, she stopped, started again. This is the thing I needed. To go to the board, I needed something concrete, and this is concrete. It's a start. Your counsel will tell you what's enough to act on. Can you send me Elaine's file directly? Already sent. A brief silence. You sent it before you called me. I wanted you to have it the moment the call ended. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Thank you, she said, and this time it carried more weight than the word usually does. The following 2 weeks moved with the specific intensity of a situation in motion, the kind of motion that cannot or meaningfully slowed, only managed. Cassandra met with her board chair on a Wednesday. Her outside counsel reviewed Elaine's documentation and authorized 2 additional investigative steps. A forensic accountant was brought in to examine the data room access logs in conjunction with a timeline Cassandra's team had reconstructed. Grant was not in any of these meetings. He was not part of the legal machinery or the board dynamics or the investigative process. He was outside of it, maintaining the perimeter of her daily life, adjusting the route protocols, checking in with Marcus twice daily, reviewing Elaine's supplemental findings as they came in. He was doing what he knew how to do, in the way he knew how to do it, which meant staying in his lane and trusting the people with the relevant expertise to be in theirs. Sadie asked him once, during this period, whether he was happy. He was making sandwiches. He turned around to look at her. Why are you asking? You seem like you're carrying something heavy, she said. But not like you're sad, more like you're working. I'm working on something. Yeah. She looked at him with the direct brown eyes that were entirely Mallory's and entirely her own simultaneously. Is it going okay? He thought about the answer. I think so. It's complicated. Is Cassandra okay? He turned back to the sandwiches. She's handling a difficult situation very well. She seems like the kind of person who handles things, Sadie said, in the way of someone confirming a pre-existing assessment. She is, Grant said. The evening it happened was not dramatic in its build-up, which was the thing he should have been watching for the absence of escalation that sometimes precedes a sharp action, the way a situation cools on the surface just before it breaks. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, and Cassandra had attended a small private dinner at a colleague's restaurant, a gathering of 6 people, not publicly listed anywhere, planned within 48 hours. Grant had reviewed the venue's layout in the afternoon. He had approved the route Marcus planned for after. He was not supposed to be there. He had told himself he didn't need to be there. He drove by the restaurant at 7:30 and then told himself he was in the neighborhood for no reason in particular, and then he parked and sat in his car 2 blocks away and acknowledged to himself, with the clarity that the night air and the silence sometimes produced, that he was not going to go home. At 9:15 the dinner ended and the 6 people said their goodbyes on the restaurant's front steps. Cassandra and Marcus walked to the car, which was parked in a lot half a block away, the same lot Grant had approved that afternoon. Good sightlines, 2 exits, attendant on duty. Grant watched from his car. They were 20 feet from the parking lot entrance when the lights in the lot went out. Not a gradual dimming, all at once. The whole structure went dark simultaneously, which was not how electrical failures happened. Grant was out of his car before he had consciously decided to move. He covered the 2 blocks at a pace that was not running. Running attracts attention. Running changes what a situation looks like to observers. Running is the last resort, but was close to it. The controlled fast movement of someone who has covered ground under pressure before and knows the difference between speed and noise. He came around the corner and saw 3 things in sequence. Marcus 10 feet from the lot entrance, hand at his hips, assessing good. Marcus was reacting and Cassandra 2 steps behind Marcus, facing outward the way Grant had taught her, which was also good, and a vehicle, not the Arbridge sedan, a different vehicle, a panel van with its side door open, positioned at the parking lot's second exit, 50 feet ahead, blocking the lane. 4 men, coming from the van, not running, either walking with purpose, spread laterally to cover the width of the lane, wearing the kind of generic dark clothing that said hired rather than criminal. Grant came around Marcus's left side and put himself between Cassandra and the four men, and everything in him that had been a civilian for 6 years stepped aside without argument. "Stay behind me," he said, quiet, completely level. Not to Marcus. Marcus knew his job. To Cassandra. To make sure she heard it and understood that what was happening now had a specific structure and her position within it was defined. She moved behind him without hesitation. The four men stopped when they saw Grant step forward. He had counted on this. The insertion of an unexpected element into a planned approach requires a beat of recalibration, and he used that beat. "Marcus," he said, not turning, "call 911 now, and get your hand off your weapon. We're not doing anything that escalates this to a level where police have a reason to complicate the aftermath." "Got it," Marcus said, and the phone came out. Grant faced the four men. The one at the center, slightly forward of the others, slightly larger. The one making the approach decisions had stopped about 30 feet out. He was reassessing. Grant could see it in the specific quality of his stillness. "Here's what you should understand," Grant said, at a volume that carried without projecting. "You don't know what I am. You planned this for a security team and a target. What you've got now is something different, and the decision you make in the next 15 seconds is going to determine how the rest of this evening goes for you." The man in the center said nothing. He was looking at Grant with the specific attention of someone trying to read a situation that has not gone the way it was drawn up. "The police have been called," Grant continued. "There's a camera on the northeast corner of this structure that has had you on it since you left the van. You're already documented. Anything that happens in the next 60 seconds adds to that documentation and not in your favor." He could hear Cassandra breathing behind him. Controlled. Measured. She was frightened. He knew her well enough to know this, but she was using the fear correctly, compressing it into alertness rather than letting it expand into paralysis. The man in the center looked at his associates, then back at Grant. Grant held the position. He had learned over 12 years, and in conditions far more extreme than this, that the most powerful thing a trained person can do in a standoff is demonstrate that they are not afraid to wait. Fear moves, certainty stands still. And in the gap between those two things, in the 30 feet of parking lot and November dark that separated Grant from four hired men with an objective they were no longer confident they could execute, the calculation shifted. The man in the center took one step back, then another. Grant did not move forward. He did not advance into the space being vacated, because advancing restarted the dynamic, and this was exactly the moment where patience was everything. The four men returned to the van. The van's engine started. It moved toward the lot's secondary exit and out onto the cross street and away. Grant stood in the dark parking lot and breathed for exactly 3 seconds, and then turned. Cassandra was looking at him. Not the way people look at someone who has just done something dramatic. Not with the particular expression of someone who has been rescued. She was looking at him the way she looked at things she was genuinely trying to understand, with the full weight of her attention, direct and unsparing, taking in the fact of him. "Grant," she said, "are you hurt?" No, she didn't look away. "No, I'm no." Marcus was on the phone talking to 911, giving location, describing the van. He had the plate number. Grant had registered it automatically. "Give Marcus the plate," he told Cassandra. "I have it 374 Lima Foxtrot 9. She relayed it without looking away from Grant. The sirens were audible 2 minutes later. Someone in the surrounding blocks must have called before Marcus did, because they were fast. Grant stayed where he was and let the scene develop around him. And Marcus handled the initial contact with the first responders with the correct combination of professional credibility and factual precision. And the van was stopped 4 blocks away because the plate was in the system inside of 90 seconds. Grant learned later, from a detective who interviewed him the following morning, that the driver of the van was Colin Strasser, the man Grant had been watching from a distance for 2 months. The former private investigator, who had lost his license for illegal surveillance, and had apparently widened his professional scope since then. The 4 men who got out of the van were not charged. That night they dispersed on foot before the cordon tightened and were not found immediately. But Strasser was in custody, and Strasser, when presented with the documentation Elaine had compiled over 2 months and the additional evidence from the parking lot cameras, made the decision that people in his position frequently make when the alternative is absorbing the full weight of consequences alone. He gave them Theodore Marsh's name. He gave them Russell Kincaid's name. He gave them the structure of the arrangement, the side deal, the information leak, the pressure campaign in enough detail that Cassandra's outside counsel, who was on the phone with her at 11:30 that night, said the word actionable 3 times in 4 minutes. Grant sat in a police station waiting room for an hour while statements were taken. And then he drove Cassandra home because Marcus had to stay for additional questioning. And she had dismissed the second security team member earlier that evening because the dinner was supposed to be simple and safe, and none of them had known it wouldn't be. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the city moving past, and said nothing for 6 blocks, and then said, "How did you know to be there tonight?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I approved the route. I knew the layout. That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I drove by," he said. "I told myself I was in the neighborhood." She turned her head to look at him. He could feel the weight of it on the side of his face. "You weren't in the neighborhood," she said. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She turned back to the window, and after a moment she said, very quietly, "I saw you come around that corner. Before you said anything. Before anything had actually happened yet. A pause. The way you moved. I've never seen you move like that." "I know. You're not just someone who was in the military," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said, "I'm not." She was quiet for the rest of the drive. He walked her to her building entrance, a point where she usually said goodnight, with the brisk, warm efficiency of someone who guards their private space carefully. Tonight she stood at the entrance and looked at him in the yellow light above the door with an expression that had no performance left in it. "You were a SEAL," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes." She nodded slowly, absorbing it, rearranging things around it. "You've been all of this. The route changes, the logistics, the way you stood in that parking lot, that's not just instinct. That's training at a level I didn't." She stopped. "I didn't know what you were. Not the specifics, I don't advertise it." "I know you don't." Her eyes were very steady. "Grant. The way you stepped in front of me." He said nothing. "You put yourself between me and 4 men without a second's hesitation, and you stood there like it was the most ordinary thing you'd ever done." "It was the only reasonable option," he said. "It was not the only option," she said. "It was the option you chose." Without thinking about it. She looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you been doing that?" He understood what she was actually asking. "Since the terrace," he said. "Since the wedding." She looked at him for a long time in the light above her door, in the cold of the November night, with the sounds of the city doing the ordinary things cities do behind them. And what was in her face was not the composure she showed the world, and not the unguarded planning mode he'd seen in the warehouse. It was something quieter and more fragile and more honest than either. "Go home," she said finally. "Get some sleep. You too." She put her hand on the door, then she stopped. "Grant." "Yeah, thank you." She said it differently than she had said it before, not the efficient gratitude of someone acknowledging a professional courtesy. Differently. In a register that he would be thinking about for a long time. For everything. Not just tonight, she went inside. He stood at the door for a moment in the cold, and then he walked back to his car, and the city moved around him in its ordinary way, and the November night pressed down cold and clear, and Grant Halberd drove home to his quiet apartment and sat in his kitchen in the dark for a while, not sleeping, just sitting, with the particular feeling of a man who has been moving at a certain velocity for a long time, and has just, for the first time, allowed himself to wonder where he is actually going. He slept 4 hours that night, which was 2 more than he expected. When he woke at 5:47, the apartment was still dark, and the city outside was in that particular pre-dawn sun state where the night shift hasn't ended and the day shift hasn't started, and the streets belong briefly to no one. He lay on his back for a few minutes and ran through the previous evening with the methodical, unglamorous discipline of a post-operation review, what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd gotten right, what he'd gotten wrong. What he'd gotten wrong. He should have flagged the dinner venue the moment he learned about it, even with the short planning window. He had told himself the 48-hour rule was protective enough. It wasn't. He had also told himself he didn't need to be there in person, which had been a form of self-management that was closer to self-deception. He'd known the situation was escalating. He'd known the parking lot had one vulnerability, the secondary exit, the one Marcus had planned to avoid, but that the van had positioned itself to control. He had approved a route without fully accounting for an adversary who had clearly been studying the same map. He had been present when it counted, but the margin had been tighter than it should have been. He got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Elaine's 12-page document and the supplemental files she'd sent in the days since, going through them again with the specific attention of a man who was now preparing to hand them to people who had used them inside systems he didn't control. Evidence was different from intelligence. Intelligence you used operationally. Evidence had to survive scrutiny lawyers, investigators, cross-examination by people whose job was to find the seam where something could be taken apart. He was not a lawyer. But he'd been trained to build documentation that held under pressure, and he read Elaine's work with that lens, noting 3 places where the chain of inference was solid and 2 where it would need additional support. At 7:15, he called Elaine. "I saw the news brief," she said, without preamble. Strasser was picked up. Yes, he cooperated. Gave them Marsh and Kincaid by name. A pause. "Well, that moves things along. Her counsel needs to know about the side arrangement documentation you found the second layer. The preliminary stuff. It corroborates what Strasser said. I'll package it this morning." Another pause. "Grant. Is she all right?" He thought about Cassandra standing at her building entrance in the yellow light, the look on her face with no performance left in it. "She will be," he said. He sent her a text at 7:40. "How are you sleeping?" Not a question. An observation framed as one. Her response came 11 minutes later, which meant she'd been awake for a while. "I slept 3 hours and then gave up and read the forensic accountant's preliminary summary. The access log correlation is cleaner than I thought." Russell was in the data room at 11:47 p.m. on the night before each disclosure. Every time. A pause, then another message. "How are you sleeping?" 4 hours, he wrote back. "Better than 3. Marginally." Then, "I need to talk to you today. Not by phone." He looked at the message for a moment. "Tell me when." "Noon. There's a coffee place on Clement Street, East Side. The one with the green door." He knew it. He had driven past it once and noted it the way he noted most things automatically, categorized, filed. "I'll be there." He dropped Sadie at school, drove to his office, handled 2 hours of maritime contract work that required his attention, and received it with roughly 60% of his brain, while the other 40% ran quiet calculations about the day ahead. His office manager, a practical woman named Ruth, who had worked with him for 4 years and had strong opinions about workplace communication, told him he looked like he'd been awake since Thursday. "Close," he said. "The Hartwell dinner was on the news this morning," she said. "The parking lot thing, I heard." She looked at him with the specific look of someone who has worked alongside a person long enough to understand which questions are worth asking. She did not ask any of them. He arrived at the coffee place on Clement Street at 11:52. Cassandra was already there, at a corner table, both hands wrapped around a mug. She was wearing a dark coat over a gray sweater, hair down. He had rarely seen her hair down outside of the warehouse, the evening walks, the private geography of the hours they'd accumulated between their public and professional selves. She looked like she hadn't slept enough and had stopped caring about concealing it. He got coffee and sat across from her and waited. She looked at him for a moment. Direct, as always. But there was something different in it today, the assessment layer thinner than usual, like a transparency that had worn down to almost nothing. "Russell resigned this morning," she said. Grant set down his mug. "Before or after the board met?" "Before. He sent an email to my board chair at 6 a.m. 2 paragraphs. He referenced personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. She said this with the precise flatness of someone reporting facts that are personally painful and professionally infuriating simultaneously. He didn't acknowledge any of it. Not one word about Marsh, not one word about the leak, not one word about what Strasser did last night. His lawyer told him not to. Obviously, she looked at her coffee. 6 years. He was in the room for everything. She shook her head once, a short, definitive movement. "I keep running the timeline, trying to figure out when it started. Whether there was a point where I should have seen it." "Probably not," Grant said. "People who do this well are specifically good at being trusted." "That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's just true." He leaned forward slightly. "Cassandra. His resignation doesn't resolve the legal exposure, his counsel knows that. Cooperating now versus having the evidence presented to a DA without his input is a calculation he's running. This isn't over for him legally. I know. She looked up at him. My outside counsel called at 8. Strasser's cooperation statement, combined with Elaine's documentation and the access logs, is enough to open a formal investigation into both Kincaid and Marsh. My board authorized legal action this morning. She paused. It's in other hands now. The part I can control, I've done. The rest of it goes into the legal system and takes as long as it takes. He nodded. And the acquisition? Still on track. Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, more like the recognition of having crossed a line she wasn't sure she'd reach. The regulatory review was unaffected. Meridian's board has been kept informed throughout. My lead contact there knew something was wrong with the information dynamic before I did, actually. She's a careful reader of rooms. A pause. The deal closes in 6 weeks if nothing else breaks. Nothing else will break, he said, and he said it not as reassurance but as an assessment, because the operation was dismantled now. Strasser in custody, Marsh named in a formal investigation, Russell gone, Arbridge Associates documented. The machine that had been running against her had no more moving parts. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her mug and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the expression he had come to understand as her most honest register, the one that appeared when she had stopped managing the conversation and was simply in it. I want to talk about you, she said. He waited. Not about last night. Not about the operational stuff. She held his gaze. About you. Grant wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. He had known this conversation was coming in the way that weather is coming, you can't see it yet, but the pressure has changed, and the air has a different quality, and only a fool would claim to be surprised when the rain arrives. All right, he said. You've been inside my life for 5 months, she said. You've been watching over me since June before you had any professional reason to, before we knew each other, before any of this was anything other than a man at a wedding who noticed something other people missed. She paused. You changed the routes. You called Marcus. You tracked Elaine's investigation in your own time. You drove by the restaurant last night because you couldn't make yourself not. She looked at him steadily. And through all of it, you have been precise. Careful. You give me information and let me make decisions. You don't override me. You don't tell me what to do. Another pause. But you're also behind a wall, Grant. You have been this whole time. He didn't say anything. I don't mean the professional distance. I understand operational habits. I mean, she stopped, chose her words the way she chose everything, carefully, from a considered range of options. You protected Sadie through a divorce that clearly cost you. You protect Mallory still. You came to her wedding because your daughter needed you there, and you sat in the third row and kept it uncomplicated. You protected me for 5 months before you protected yourself from anything. She unfolded her hands, put them flat on the table. Who does that for you? The question landed in a part of him that he had been keeping very carefully unoccupied. He looked at his coffee for a moment, then back at her. That's not a simple question, he said. I know. I'm not asking it simply. He breathed in, let it out slowly. I was good at protecting things before I was good at anything else, he said. I enlisted because I wanted to do something that mattered, and it turned out I was useful in a specific way that the military values. I was good in the field. I was good under pressure. I was good at keeping people alive. He paused. I was less good at coming home. At being present when there was no threat to manage. Mallory would have told you that directly, and she'd have been right. What did she say when you left the military? That she was relieved. He said it without bitterness, because it had been long enough now that he could say it accurately rather than painfully. She'd spent 4 years being married to a man who was either deployed or processing the fact that he wasn't deployed. She wanted someone who was actually there. I didn't know how to be that person at the time. He paused. I'm better at it now. Sadie required it. You can't be half present with an 8-year-old who notices everything. Cassandra was quiet for a moment. You said you were less good at being present when there was no threat to manage. Yes. You've been managing a threat for 5 months. She held his gaze. Is that part of why this has been easier than it might otherwise be? Being useful in a specific way? He looked at her. She was asking the question without judgment, with the clinical honesty of someone who wants an accurate answer more than a comfortable one. He recognized this quality in her because it was one he valued in himself, and because it was what made her both difficult and, underneath the difficulty, easy to trust. Probably yes, he said, to some degree. The context gave me a structure that I know how to operate in. He paused. But that's not the whole answer. What's the rest of it? He looked at her for a long moment. At the coffee shop around them, ordinary and unhurried, with its green door and its mismatched chairs and its complete indifference to the fact that something significant was happening at the corner table. I noticed you at the wedding because you were the most present person in the room, he said. Not the most visible, the most present. You were doing the work of being at a social event, and simultaneously you were somewhere inside yourself, and both things were true at the same time, and I recognized it. He paused. I kept watching because my instincts said something was wrong, and I trusted my instincts. But I came back to the lecture, to the coffee, all of it because somewhere in the first 2 hours of knowing you, I ran out of reasons not to. She looked at him for a long time. You're not a simple person, she said. No, he agreed. Neither am I. I know, she looked at her hands on the table, then back up at him. I'm not asking you to stop protecting people. I don't want you to be a different person, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I don't want to be someone you're protecting from a distance. Her voice was steady, but the thing underneath it wasn't steadiness. It was the particular weight of someone saying something that requires more courage than most things they do. I've been in this for a while, Grant, whatever this is. And I think you have been too. Yes, he said, simply. Without qualification. She held his gaze, and the expression on her face was one he had seen in versions before, but never quite like this, the composure and the openness at the same time, both real, neither canceling the other out. Okay, she said, and then, after a moment with the smallest edge of the dry precision he'd come to love, was that difficult? Moderately, he said. She smiled then, not the brief, controlled version that appeared in professional contexts, but the real one, the one that changed her whole face, that he had first seen on the terrace in June when he'd said something honest and she'd said you didn't mean the dress. He had spent 5 months trying to earn that smile with some regularity and had not entirely succeeded until now. They sat in the coffee shop for another hour, not talking about the investigation or the acquisition or the parking lot. Talking about Sadie's latest classroom dispute, which involved an argument with a classmate about whether Pluto deserved its reclassification that had apparently lasted 2 days and been resolved by Sadie presenting a 3-point written argument to her teacher, who had read it aloud to the class. Talking about the warehouse building and a preliminary architectural assessment Cassandra had commissioned, which had confirmed the mezzanine was structurally feasible and the skylight could be fully restored. Talking about small, ordinary things, the way people talk when they have decided to stop managing the distance between themselves and just be in the room with each other. It was not seamless. They were both too careful, too accustomed to monitoring their own output, to simply let go of all the habits at once. There were moments when he caught himself framing something with operational precision, when plain language would have served better, and moments when she pulled back toward executive mode, when the conversation moved into territory that felt exposed. They were two people who had spent years getting good at being self-contained, and self-containment doesn't dissolve in an afternoon. But the conversation had a different quality from anything before it, the quality two people who have stopped pretending there's something other than what they are to each other. He walked her back to her office building. It was a 4-block walk, and they did it in the cold December air, without particular urgency. At the entrance, she stopped and looked at him, and then she took a step forward and kissed him. Not long, not dramatic. The kind of kiss that is not a beginning or an ending, but a statement declarative, clear without ambiguity, the kind that says I've decided rather than I'm wondering. He put one hand at the side of her face, briefly, because she was right there, and it was the most natural thing. And then she stepped back and looked at him with the expression of someone who has done exactly what she intended to do and has no regrets about it. You look surprised, she said. I was under the impression I was waiting for you, he said. You were. I'm done making you wait. She held his gaze for a moment. Go do your work, Grant. I'll call you tonight. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the December cold and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight, or rather, had known was tight for so long that he'd stopped registering it as tightness and had reclassified it as simply the way things were. The investigation into Russell Kincaid and Theodore Marsh took on its own momentum from there, moving through the legal system in the way that formally opened investigations move steadily, with the grinding bureaucratic patience of a process that does not hurry for anyone. Cassandra's outside counsel worked with investigators from 2 agencies. Elaine's documentation proved to be as solid as Grant had assessed it, the chain of inference held up under prosecutorial review, and the supplemental material she'd packaged the morning after the parking lot incident filled the 2 gaps he'd identified. Strasser's cooperation statement corroborated the core architecture of the scheme. Marsh's attorney was making noise about insufficient evidence, which was what attorneys do when the evidence is sufficient and they know it. Russell Kincaid hired a criminal defense attorney within 4 days of his resignation. The attorney released a statement saying his client was fully cooperating with investigators and had acted under significant personal and financial duress, a framing that told Grant everything he needed to know about which way Russell's defense was going to run. Cooperating witnesses with compelling mitigation stories sometimes got favorable treatment. Sometimes they didn't. That was the legal system's domain, not his. What happened inside Vantage Systems after Russell's departure was Cassandra's domain, and she managed it with the methodical, unglamorous thoroughness that characterized everything she did. She briefed her full executive team the week after his resignation, not a sanitized version, a complete one. She had decided, she told Grant that evening on the phone, that the company needed to understand what had happened in order to understand why the governance changes she was implementing were necessary and not punitive. She was right about this in his assessment. Organizations that get partial information about serious failures tend to fill the gaps with speculation, and speculation is almost always worse than fact. She hired an outside firm to audit data room access protocols and recommend new security architecture. She restructured the information governance for the Meridian integration. She brought in an interim VP of strategic development, a steady, methodical woman named Carol Feinberg, who had run similar functions at 2 other technology companies and had the specific quality, Cassandra said, of being unimpressed by both crises and successes, which was exactly what the role required right now. She worked 16-hour days for 3 weeks. Grant watched this from the position he'd settled into present, available, not hovering. He had learned the difference, finally, between being there and being in the way. He called when she said she'd be hard to reach and sent short texts, when she was in back-to-back meetings that she could answer in 30 seconds. He drove Sadie to a school event on a Thursday night because Mallory had a conflict, and Sadie, buckled in the back seat, said very seriously, "Cassandra texted me a thumbs up when I told her about the Pluto argument." That was good of her. It was, Grant said. She's busy right now, right, with work? Very busy. Sadie looked out the window. She'll finish, she said, with the confidence of someone who has assessed the relevant data and arrived at a conclusion. Yeah, Grant said. She will. He had dinner with Mallory in the second week of December, just the 2 of them, while Sadie was at a sleepover, a thing they did occasionally, because they were both adults who had decided that the failure of their marriage did not require them to be strangers, and also because Mallory occasionally wanted to say things to Grant that she didn't want to route through Dana or the mutual friends who would inevitably have opinions. Mallory looked happy. Patrick, she said, was the kind of person who made the ordinary days feel different without requiring that the ordinary days be anything other than what they were. She said this carefully, aware of what it implied about what the ordinary days of their marriage had been. Grant listened without defending himself. There was nothing to defend. They had not been good for each other. That was simply the truth, stated in the kindest possible language. I heard about what happened, Mallory said, eventually. The parking lot thing. It was on the news, Grant. I know. You were there? Yes. She looked at him across the restaurant table with an expression that was the specific combination of things only possible from someone who had known him for a long time: concern and resignation, and something that was. Not quite pride, but was in the same general vicinity. It was Cassandra Wycliffe, she said, at the hotel. Yes, and the woman at my wedding on the terrace with you. He looked at his food. Yes. Mallory was quiet for a moment. Then she's remarkable. I mean that genuinely, not as a compliment to you. She built something extraordinary. She did. Are you Mallory started, then changed the framing. Is she good to you? He looked up at her. The question caught him in a way he hadn't expected, not because it was invasive, but because of the specific sincerity of it. Mallory had loved him imperfectly, and he had loved her imperfectly, and the marriage had failed in ways that were fundamentally about who they both were rather than who they chose to be, and she was still asking whether someone was good to him. "She is," he said. Mallory nodded. "Good." She picked up her wine glass. "You're better at being present than you used to be." Sadie required it. Sadie always knew what she needed from you. She looked at him steadily. "You required it too. You just took longer to figure that out." He didn't argue with this, because she was right, and because she'd earned the right to say it. The Meridian acquisition closed on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of January, 14 months after Cassandra had first announced it internally. Grant knew it was closing that day. He'd been following the timeline for 2 months, and he did not call or text during the board meeting or the signing or the press statement that went out at 4:30. He let it be hers. She had built this deal, defended it, protected it through circumstances that would have derailed most people, and the moment of its completion belonged entirely to her. She called him at 6:17 from what sounded like a car. "It's done," she said. He could hear in her voice what she was probably not showing her face, the specific, private quality of a thing that has cost everything and finally resolved. "Congratulations," he said. A pause. "I'm in the car. Marcus is driving. I'm going home to sleep for approximately 11 hours. Another pause. "I wanted to tell you first." He held the phone for a moment in the quiet of his kitchen. "I'm glad you did. I'll see you this weekend," she said. "I have plans." "What plans?" "They involve Sadie and the farmer's market and the specific coffee cart she prefers, and I've already cleared it with Mallory's custody schedule, so you can't logistically object." He felt the warmth that happened in his chest, specifically in her vicinity, the one he'd stopped trying to categorize. "You cleared it with Mallory's schedule. Coordination is a professional strength of mine. I've noticed. Go to sleep, Grant. You look tired." "You can't see me. I don't need to." The warmth in her voice under the precision was the kind that only happened when she'd stopped measuring what she was showing. "Sleep. I'll call you tomorrow." The farmer's market Saturday arrived with the specific perfection that January occasionally manages cold and clear, with a low winter sun that made everything look sharper than it was. The produce stands bright against the pale sky. Sadie walked between them, with her hands in her coat pockets, narrating her opinions of various winter vegetables with the earnest authority of someone who has strong positions on most things and has decided that root vegetables are, generally speaking, underrated. "Parsnips specifically," she said. "Nobody takes parsnips seriously." "I take parsnips seriously," Cassandra said. Sadie looked up at her. "Do you actually cook them? Or are you just saying that?" "I roast them with olive oil and a small amount of honey and black pepper. They're better than you'd expect." Sadie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "I would try that," she said finally. "I'll make them sometime." Sadie accepted this and moved on to a strong position about the underutilization of fennel, and Grant walked beside them in the January sunlight and felt something that he had not felt in a long time, a version of presence that was not the practiced, deliberate presence of a man compensating for his own instinct to disappear, but something easier and more involuntary than that. He was simply there. In the cold and the light, with his daughter navigating the politics of winter produce and Cassandra walking alongside her with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything that she was genuinely interested in, which had come to include Sadie in a way that was neither performed nor managed, but simply real. At the coffee cart, Sadie ordered with the confidence of a regular and carried her hot chocolate to a nearby bench and immediately began studying something in her pocket that turned out to be a folded printout about Pluto's geological features, because she was building a supplemental argument to the one she'd already submitted, and this was simply what Sadie did. Grant and Cassandra stood at the edge of the cart's small footprint with their coffees, and the market moved around them, and nobody looked at them for any reason, and it was, he thought, the most ordinary and most adequate moment he'd experienced in years. "She's something," Cassandra said, watching Sadie study her printout. "She really is. She has your attention span. The way she focuses." "She got that from herself," he said. "I just tried not to interrupt it." Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What did your marriage being over feel like?" "I don't mean the logistics. I mean, what did it feel like to have the family structure you'd built stop being the shape you thought your life was?" He thought about it. She was not asking him carelessly. She never did anything carelessly. And the question was not about him and Mallory, but about something she was working through in her own architecture. Like a room you'd been in for years that you walked out of, and the door closed, he said. And then you were standing in a hallway without a map, and you had Sadie, and you figured out how to build something that worked for her, and eventually it started to work for you too. He paused. It took longer than I'd like to admit. She looked at her coffee. I've never built a life with another person, she said. I've built a company. I know how to build something with many people if there's a clear objective and shared terms. But the personal version, I've kept it separate, deliberately. I know, he said. It's not that I couldn't. It's that I was afraid the cost would be something I wasn't willing to pay. She looked up at him. I'm less afraid of that now. He looked at her steadily. What changed? She turned to look at Sadie on the bench, who was now annotating her printout with a small pencil from her coat pocket. I watched you with her, she said quietly, for months. The way you're present with her, not performing it, not trying to compensate for anything, just genuinely there. The way she trusts it completely, without thinking about it. She turned back to him. I wanted to trust something like that. I thought I'd forgotten how. A pause. Turns out I just needed the right evidence. He put his arm around her, there at the coffee cart, in the cold January market, with Sadie annotating her Pluto research on a bench 15 feet away. Cassandra leaned into it by approximately half an inch, which from her was the equivalent of anyone else leaning in completely, and he understood this and appreciated it and did not require more. Sadie looked up from her printout at that moment, looked at them, looked back at her printout, and said to no one in particular, or perhaps to the printout itself good. Grant looked at his daughter over the top of Cassandra's head. Sadie was already reading again, her pencil moving, utterly at home in her own focused world. He felt the warmth in his chest that had no adequate name. Good, he thought. The legal proceedings against Russell Kincaid moved through their early stages over the following months, with the slow procedural certainty of a machine that has been set in motion and will reach its destination regardless of the inconvenience this causes to everyone adjacent to it. Russell's attorney's cooperation narrative had partial traction. Russell maintained he had not anticipated that the pressure campaign would escalate to the physical intimidation at the parking lot, which was plausible, and also, as Cassandra's counsel noted dryly, not a complete defense. Theodore Marsh contested jurisdiction on 3 grounds, 2 of which were dismissed within the first 2 months, and his attorney pivoted to a mitigation strategy that acknowledged the side arrangement while characterizing its intent as within legal gray area, a characterization that the prosecuting team found creative and unconvincing. Cassandra followed the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understands that justice and outcome are not the same thing, and has decided to accept the difference without letting it contaminate what she has built. She mentioned it when there was something concrete to mention. She did not obsess over it, because obsessing over things she could not control was not in her operational vocabulary, and also because she had decided Grant knew this. She had said so directly in December that she was not going to let what Russell had done continue costing her after the moment it had been stopped. He took enough, she'd said. He doesn't get my time on top of it. Grant had said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. What he did spend time on, in the months between January and the spring, was something he had not spent time on in years, the deliberate, uncertain, occasionally frustrating work of building a life that had room for another person in it. He was not good at all of it. He was out of practice in ways that were sometimes embarrassing, and occasionally comic. He overplanned things that should have been spontaneous, and under-communicated things he should have said out loud, and once had an entirely unnecessary argument with Cassandra about scheduling a weekend, because he had been operating from his custody calendar without sharing it, and she had been operating from her board calendar without sharing it, and they had. Both made incompatible assumptions without realizing it. That argument had lasted 20 minutes and resolved in the specific way that arguments resolve between 2 people who are both too analytically precise to sustain irrational positions. For long they identified the actual problem, which was the incompatible calendar assumptions, and they fixed it, which took approximately 3 minutes once they'd correctly diagnosed it. And then they sat with the slightly sheepish aftermath of 2 competent adults who had briefly been ridiculous. We should share our calendars, Cassandra said. Yes, Grant said. That's a very domestic thing to do, she said. I know. She looked at him with the small, real smile. Okay, she said. They shared their calendars. Sadie, who had been in the next room doing homework during the argument and had heard none of its content but had absorbed its emotional register with her particular precision, assessed the outcome from the kitchen doorway and said, "Better." "Better," Grant confirmed. She nodded and returned to her homework. Cassandra looked at the doorway Sadie had occupied and then at Grant. "She's going to be extraordinary," she said. "I know." He looked at the doorway, too. "I'm trying to make sure I don't get in the way of that." "You won't," Cassandra said. "That's the thing about you. You don't get in the way of people being what they're going to be. You just make sure the conditions are right." She paused. "You've been doing it for me for months." He looked at her. The evening light was coming through the kitchen window at the low angle that March evenings produce, and she was standing in his kitchen in the apartment that was small and functional and had Sadie's drawings on the refrigerator door, and she looked more at home than she had any particular reason to look, and he felt the thing in his chest that was not nameable but was also, by this point, not unfamiliar. "You didn't need the conditions," he said. "You were going to do this regardless." "Maybe," she said, "but it was easier with someone watching the perimeter." She said it with a dryness that acknowledged the multiple registers of what she was saying, and he understood all of them, and neither of them needed to explain it further. He kissed her then, in his kitchen, in the March light, with Sadie's homework proceeding in the next room, and the calendars now shared, and the legal proceedings moving at their own pace in their own lane, with the world outside doing what the world did, ordinary and continuous and indifferent, and also somehow exactly right. It was not a perfect moment. His coffee was cold on the counter, and there was a grocery list on the table that he hadn't finished, and he had a conference call in 40 minutes that he was going to have to manage from his home office. Cassandra had a document she needed to review before tomorrow's board prep, and had mentioned it twice, which meant it was sitting in the back of her attention even now. None of this made the moment smaller. If anything, it made it more real, more genuinely the shape of what they were actually building, which was not a cinematic thing but a daily thing, with all the friction and scheduling and imperfect communication that daily things require. He pulled back and looked at her. "You good?" he said. She looked up at him with the dark eyes that missed nothing, that had been reading him accurately since June, that he had stopped trying to be opaque to some time in November. "Yes," she said. "I'm good." And she was, and he was, and in the next room Sadie turned a page, and the March light moved across the kitchen floor, and the day continued. The Community Education Center opened on a Saturday in late August, 14 months after the Meridian acquisition closed, and 26 months after Grant had followed Cassandra through a broken gate into an empty building, where the skylight was intact, and the west wall could support a mezzanine, and neither of them had said out loud what was already true. The restoration had taken 11 months from the day, the estate dispute finally resolved, and the property transferred. Cassandra had hired an architectural firm that specialized in historic rehabilitation, a project manager she'd worked with on Vantage's office expansion, and a community advisory board of 7 people drawn from the neighborhoods surrounding the building. Parents, teachers, a retired librarian named George, who had opinions about reading room lighting that he expressed at length and with evidence, and 2 teenagers from a local high school who said very little in meetings, but whose written feedback on the youth program design was the most substantively useful input the project received. Grant had watched this unfold from the position he'd come to occupy in her life, close enough to understand what she was building, far enough back to let her build it. He had driven her to site visits on Saturday mornings when she had back-to-back calls from 7 a.m. and needed someone to navigate while she was on the phone. He had listened to her work through the program design, across dinner tables and kitchen counters, and the front seat of his truck, asking the occasional question that helped her hear her own thinking more clearly, which was the thing she said she needed most, and which he had discovered, to his own surprise, that he was reasonably good at. He had also fixed a structural issue on the building's north staircase that the contractor had flagged as minor, and that Grant, on the basis of a single look, had flagged as not minor. He had been right. The contractor had been professional enough to acknowledge this without requiring a significant production about it, and the staircase had been properly addressed. And Cassandra had looked at Grant afterward with the expression she wore when she was recalibrating, something she thought she already knew. "How do you know about staircases?" she'd said. I know about a lot of things that don't obviously connect, he'd said. I've noticed, she'd said, and left it there, which he appreciated. The building had been named the Wycliffe Harmon Center, the Harmon in honor of Cassandra's mother, a woman named Patricia Harmon, who had taught high school chemistry in Charlotte for 31 years, and who, when Cassandra called to tell her about the naming, had been quiet for so long that Cassandra had checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. It hadn't. Patricia had simply been sitting with it, which was how she handled things that mattered most to her. Grant had met Patricia in April, at a dinner in Cassandra's apartment that was framed as casual and was thoroughly prepared for in ways that only someone who knew Cassandra well would recognize. Cassandra had actually cooked, which Grant knew was not her default mode, but which she executed with the methodical precision she applied to everything she took seriously, and had set the table with care and had been, in the 45 minutes before Patricia arrived, approximately 12% less composed than her usual baseline. Patricia Harmon was 63, small, with close-cropped gray hair, and the specific quality of presence that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms full of teenagers who would rather be anywhere else, a baseline patience that ran very deep, combined with an absolute refusal to be condescended to. She had looked at Grant across the dinner table with the frank assessment of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know exactly what she's looking at, and had said, "Cassandra tells me you were Navy." "Yes, ma'am. She also tells me you were the person who noticed something was wrong before anyone else did." I had useful context. Patricia had looked at him for a moment longer. "She doesn't let people take care of her," she said. "She never has. She decided when she was about 12 that she was going to be the person other people relied on, and she's been that person ever since." A pause. "It costs something. She doesn't always show the cost." "I know," Grant said. Patricia looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I think you do." Cassandra from the kitchen had called something about the timing of the main course, and the conversation had moved on, and Grant had sat with what Patricia had said in the particular way. He sat with things that were important attentively, without rushing to do anything with them. He liked Patricia. She was direct and funny and had no patience for performance of any kind, which meant that dinner with her and Cassandra involved a quality of honest conversation that was slightly exhilarating and occasionally uncomfortable and exactly what it should be. Patricia told a story about Cassandra's second failed business venture that involved a misjudged wholesale electronics purchase and a storage unit in Charlotte that had taken 3 months to fully clear, and Cassandra had said mother in the tone of someone who wants it, noted that they have objections without actually expecting them to be honored, and Patricia had continued the story without modification. Grant had laughed genuinely, not socially, and Cassandra had looked at him with the expression of someone who is pretending to be more annoyed than she is, and underneath that was the expression she wore when she was actually happy, the one that was harder to see, but that he had gotten very good at finding. Sadie had met Patricia in May, at a lunch that Cassandra had organized with the same careful preparation, and the two of them had spent 40 minutes in a conversation about the chemistry of cooking that Sadie had initiated by asking whether the Maillard reaction was technically the same thing as caramelization, which it is not. And Patricia had explained the difference with the precision of someone for whom this distinction is a matter of professional integrity. And Sadie had listened with absolute attention and then said, "So when my dad burns the onions, that's Maillard. But when he makes the apples for the pancakes go brown and sweet, that's caramelization." "Exactly right," Patricia said. "I've been calling both of them burning," Sadie said, with the expression of someone who has just been given a useful correction. "I'll stop doing that." Patricia had looked at Grant across the table with an expression that said several things simultaneously, all of them favorable. The opening day of the Wycliffe Harmon Center arrived on a Saturday that cooperated with the occasion warm without being oppressive, with enough of a breeze off the river to make standing outside comfortable. The building had been transformed in ways that honored what it had been while making clear what it intended to be, the brick exterior cleaned and repointed, the arched windows restored to full transparency so the light came through the way it had been designed to, the iron fence repaired and opened wide. Inside, the concrete floors had been polished rather than covered, the timber ceiling beams left exposed and clean, the mezzanine built exactly where Cassandra had said it should go, housing a library of 2,000 donated books and a reading room, with long tables and the specific quality of quiet that good libraries achieve. The ground floor held 4 dedicated program spaces, a technology lab with 40 workstations. Funded partly through Vantage Systems and partly through a grant, Cassandra had written herself on a Sunday afternoon in February because the grant officer had told her the deadline was too close, and she had said that was the officer's assessment and not hers. A fabrication workshop with equipment for woodworking, electronics prototyping, and basic metalwork, donated through a partnership with 3 local manufacturing companies that Cassandra had personally called. A flexible classroom that could seat 60 or divide into 3 separate spaces. And a community room with a commercial kitchen, because the advisory board had spent 40 minutes in one meeting on the subject of whether people learn better with or without access to food and had concluded, empirically, that the answer was with, and Cassandra had taken this seriously, because George the retired librarian had brought data. The mezzanine library was open to all community members on a drop-in basis. The program's coding education for children aged 8 to 16, adult workforce development for digital skills, evening courses in financial literacy and small business formation had a waitlist before the building opened. Because Cassandra had announced the programs in March, and the neighborhood had responded with the enthusiasm of people who have been waiting for something like this without quite believing it would arrive. The opening ceremony was not elaborate. Cassandra had specifically said it shouldn't be elaborate, because the building wasn't for the people who would attend a ceremony. It was for the people who would use it on a Wednesday afternoon 6 months from now, and those people didn't need a ceremony, they needed a building that worked. There was a brief program, a welcome from the board chair, a short address from a city council member who had supported the zoning variance, remarks from 2 members of the community advisory board, and then Cassandra herself. Grant stood Sadie at the edge of the crowd, inside now, the central space filled with a few hundred people, and watched Cassandra at the small podium they'd set up beneath the restored skylight. She was not a natural public speaker in the way that some people are natural public speakers. She didn't perform warmth or manufacture energy. What she did instead was speak with such complete honesty about what she thought and why she thought it, that the room tended to go quiet and stay there. She talked about the building as it had been the first time she'd walked into it, the dust, the specific silence of a space that has been waiting, the geometry of the skylight in the evening light. She did not mention that she hadn't been alone that evening. Grant noted this and was glad of it. Some things belonged to the people who had been in the room and didn't require a public audience. She talked about what the center was for, not in abstract terms, in specific terms. The 8-year-old who doesn't have a computer at home but wants to learn to code. The 45-year-old who was laid off from a job that no longer exists in the form it used to and needs to rebuild a skill set in a world that didn't slow down to wait for her. The person who has an idea for a small business and no idea how to form an LLC or read a profit and loss statement. Those people don't need inspiration, she said. They need tools. This is a building full of tools. Come in and use them. She got a real response to that, the kind that comes from people who recognize when they're being spoken to directly rather than at. Sadie, beside Grant, said quietly, "She's good at this." "Yes," Grant said. "She means it," Sadie said. "You can tell when someone means it." "You can," he agreed. After the formal program, the building opened for self-guided tours and the crowd distributed itself through the spaces with the particular energy of people discovering something they hadn't expected to like as much as they did. George, the retired librarian, positioned himself on the mezzanine and offered unsolicited commentary on the reading room's lighting design to anyone who came within range, and from what Grant could observe, approximately 2/3 of those people seemed to find this interesting rather than unwelcome, which suggested George had correctly read his audience. Patricia Harmon moved through the building with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes tracking everything, and Grant watched her stop in the center of the ground floor and look up at the timber beams and then at the skylight, and the expression on her face was the one that means a person is somewhere that requires no words. Mallory and Patrick attended. They had been invited, because Sadie was there, and Cassandra had suggested it with the straightforward practicality of someone who has decided that the geometry of other people's lives is not a reason to leave them out of things. Patrick, who had done architectural work for years, moved through the restored building, with the focused appreciation of someone assessing what it had taken, and at one point found Grant near the north staircase and said, "The structural work on this is excellent. The staircase especially, someone caught something early." "Someone did," Grant said. Patrick looked at him, and then at the staircase, and then back at him with the expression of a man who has correctly assembled a picture and decided the appropriate response is a nod. They nodded at each other. It was, Grant reflected, one of the more efficient conversations he'd had in recent months. In the late afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the formal activity of the day had loosened into the comfortable dispersal of people who didn't want to leave yet, Cassandra found him. She had been moving for hours, talking to advisory board members, answering questions from the 2 journalists who'd attended, spending 20 minutes with a woman who ran a neighborhood association and wanted to discuss the possibility of evening programming for seniors, and she had done all of it with the competence that was simply her baseline. But Grant could see the tiredness underneath it now, in the slight set of her shoulders, and the way her movements had become a fraction more economical, conserving energy with the discipline of someone who has been running on a specific reserve all day. She came to where he was standing near the east windows, looking out at the river, and she stood beside him, without saying anything for a moment. The late afternoon light came through the restored glass at a low angle, and made the brick walls look warmer than they were, and outside the river moved the way rivers do. Indifferent and continuous, and somehow always the right thing to look at when you need a moment that asks nothing of you. "How are you doing?" he said. "I'm good," she said. "Tired." "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "It's real now." "It was always real. You know what I mean. The version in my head and the version standing here are the same thing now." She looked around the space, the polished floors, the people still moving through the rooms, Sadie and Patricia visible through the doorway to the library, apparently deep in a conversation that involved one of the donated books being held open between them. "That doesn't happen as often as you'd think." He looked at her profile. "You're allowed to feel good about this." "I do," she said. I want to make sure I remember what it actually feels like, before it becomes the next project." "Give yourself until Monday," he said. She looked at him with a small, real smile. "That's generous of you." "I'm a generous person." "Moderately," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, the same half-inch lean she'd given him at the coffee cart in January, which he had understood then and understood now to be everything. Outside, the river ran in the low light. In the next room, Sadie's voice rose briefly, making a point about something to Patricia, who responded with what sounded like agreement and elaboration. Grant held that moment and did not rush past it, because he had spent enough of his life moving through moments without inhabiting them, and he had made a decision, somewhere in the past year, that he was going to stop doing that. An hour later, when the building had been locked and the last of the attendees had said their goodbyes and the cleaning crew had taken over, and Cassandra had hugged her mother goodbye in the parking lot for longer than either of them usually allowed, Patricia had. Driven down from Charlotte for the weekend and was leaving in the morning, Grant took Sadie home first. She was quiet in the back seat on the drive, which was unusual for Sadie, and he checked the rearview mirror twice before understanding that she wasn't withdrawn, just processing. She did this, occasionally took in a significant experience and went interior with it, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a day, and then produced an observation that turned out to have been cooking the whole time. At home, while he was making dinner, she sat at the kitchen table and finally said, "Mrs." Harmon said Cassandra built 3 companies before she was 30. "Something like that," Grant said. She said the first 2 failed. They did. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Did she know they were going to fail before they failed? Grant considered this. I think she probably knew each one wasn't working and kept going anyway. Until she found the thing that worked. Sadie thought about this. "That's different from failing," she said. "That's just trying until you find it." That's a good way to put it. She looked at her homework, which she'd spread on the table without yet starting. "Do you think I'll know what thing I'm going to find? Or will I have to try a bunch of things first?" He turned from the stove to look at his daughter. She was 9 now. Almost 10 had been 9 for 3 months, and the change from 8 to 9 was one of those developmental shifts that is real in ways that are hard to articulate. Something about the quality of the questions becoming more genuinely uncertain, rather than testing the limits of what she already suspected. "I think you'll try things," he said. "Some will work and some won't." The ones that don't work will tell you something useful. Like what? Like what you actually want, as opposed to what you thought you wanted. She considered this. Is that what happened with you and Mom? He turned back to the stove. The question was direct and came from genuine curiosity, not from any wound. Sadie had processed the divorce in her own thorough way over the years, and had arrived at a kind of clear-eyed acceptance of it that was entirely her own. Something like that, he said. We both found out what we actually needed. It just took us longer than we'd have liked. And now you know? He thought about the answer honestly. Better than I did, he said. I'm still figuring it out, but better. Sadie nodded, apparently satisfied. She opened her homework and began, and the kitchen settled into the particular quiet of a weeknight. At home, the sounds of cooking, the scratch of a pencil, the last of the daylight letting go outside the window. Grant returned Cassandra to the building 2 hours later. Not to the front, not through the main entrance with its opened iron gate. Around to the back, to the riverside, where a door they'd used the first time they'd come in together still existed, now properly alarmed and keyed. She had the key. He had figured she would want to come back, after the day, after the crowds and the program and the people who needed things from her that she gave readily, and that cost something regardless. He had figured she would want to be in the space without anyone in it. He had been right. She had texted him at 8:30, "Are you still up?" "I want to go back." He had been up. He had driven to her building, and she had come down in a coat over what appeared to be considerably more comfortable clothes than the morning. And they had driven to the center without much conversation, and she had unlocked the side door, and they had gone in. The building at night was different from the building in the day, which was different from the building in the last light of an August evening 2 years ago. All three versions were true. The darkness made the skylight into something else. The city's ambient light came through it in a diffuse way that illuminated the central space without defining it clearly, and the timber beams were shadows, and the brick walls had no color, just depth, and the whole interior had the quality of a space that was resting, quietly, after a day of being exactly what it was meant to be. Cassandra walked to the center of the ground floor and stood under the skylight and looked up, and Grant stood a few steps back and watched her. She stayed like that for a long moment. He gave her the moment without interrupting it. Because she had built this with years of work and one particular vision, and the specific stubbornness of someone who has learned that the difference between a plan and a result is usually the willingness to outlast every obstacle. Between them and the moment belonged entirely to her. Then he walked forward and stood beside her, and they both looked up through the restored glass at the night sky above the city, which was not the dramatic star-filled sky of countryside or altitude, but the real sky of a real city, orange-gray at the edges, deeper in the center, with a handful of the brightest stars visible, despite the light pollution, stubborn and specific. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He had been carrying the ring for 6 days. He had picked it up on a Tuesday morning from a jeweler on Morrison Street who had made it to a specification. Grant had spent 2 weeks developing with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered, not elaborate, not performing the idea of a ring, just a specific considered thing. A narrow platinum band with a single stone, oval, deep blue-green, like the dress she'd been wearing the night he met her, set in a way that was secure and unobtrusive because she worked with her hands, and he had been paying attention to what she wore on them. He had not planned a speech. He did not do speeches. He had thought about what he wanted to say and had arrived at the conclusion that what he wanted to say was simply true, and true things don't usually require elaborate framing. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She looked at him. In the ambient light through the skylight, her face was clear and direct, the same face it had always been, the one that missed nothing. "Yes," she said. "On the terrace at the wedding," he said, "I told myself I wasn't watching you. I made that argument to myself for about 4 minutes before I stopped being able to maintain it." He held her gaze. "And then every time I told myself I was doing what I was doing, for a practical reason, the lecture was convenient, the coffee was nearby, the security concern was professional, I was lying to myself about the primary reason, which was that I wanted to be wherever you were, and I was finding logistical justifications for it." She was very still. "I'm not good at doing this without a reason that I can explain," he said. "I'm getting better at it. But the honest version is that somewhere between June and August, before I had any right to feel this way about someone I'd known for 8 weeks, I stopped being able to imagine going back to the life I had before you were in it. And then I spent several months not quite saying that out loud, because I wasn't sure I'd earned the right to say it yet. He paused. I think I've earned it now. He opened his hand. The ring sat in his palm, and in the ambient light from the skylight it caught what light there was and held it. Cassandra looked at it. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were very bright, which he had not seen before, and he understood that the brightness was not sadness but the opposite of it, the specific brightness of someone who has been self-contained for a long time and is deciding in this moment to stop. You said you weren't looking at the dress, she said. Her voice was steady but only barely. I wasn't, he said. I never was. She looked at the ring, then at him. Then she took a breath that was less controlled than her usual breath, which meant she had stopped controlling it, which meant everything. Yes, she said, simple, direct, entirely herself. Grant, yes. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had been careful about this, had spent 20 minutes in a conversation with the jeweler about how to estimate ring size from observation alone, because he had not wanted to ask her and lose the element of intention. It fit correctly. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was not the composure she showed the world, and not the careful professionalism, and not even the unguarded planning mode of the warehouse. It was something he had only seen in fragments before the version of her that existed, before she had learned to be so rigorously self-sufficient, the part of her that had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to be present enough and patient enough and honest enough to stay. He kissed her there, under the skylight, in the building she had built, in the dark and the ambient city light. And the city moved outside in its ordinary way, and the river ran in the dark, and the building held its breath around them, and the moment was real, completely real, with no idealization and no performance. Just two people in a restored building in late August, who had taken a long time to get here and had arrived. They were married the following spring, on a Saturday in April, inside the Wycliffe Harmon Center, in the central space beneath the skylight. Cassandra had said she didn't want to get married in a traditional wedding venue, and Grant had said that was fine, and they had looked at each other and known where, without having to say it. The building had been the place where they'd first understood what they were to each other, where the space between them compressed past the point of professional courtesy and reasonable distance and careful management and had become something that neither of them had a better word for than what it was. The ceremony was small, intentionally small, 30 people, the ones who actually counted, in a room that could hold 300. Patricia Harmon sat in the front row, with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression that of someone who is attempting to maintain composure and is doing so through sheer decades of practice. Bernard Trask attended and found Grant beforehand and said, without particular preamble, I'm glad you're both here. It took long enough. Elaine Cho attended because Grant had called her and said he thought she deserved to see how the thing she'd helped protect had ended up, and Elaine had said she would be there and had been with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose meticulous work had mattered in ways that extended beyond the case file. Marcus attended. He and Grant had developed, over the past year and a half, the particular functional friendship of two people who have protected the same person from different positions and have enough professional respect for each other to acknowledge what the other one does. They did not socialize. They did not have much in common outside the shared context. But Marcus had shaken Grant's hand at the engagement dinner. Cassandra had organized in November and had said, quietly, she needed someone who wasn't going to flinch, and Grant had nodded, and that had been sufficient. Sadie stood at the front of the room beside Cassandra. Not as a flower girl, not as a junior attendant. She stood beside Cassandra the way she had stood beside Grant at the school event and the farmer's market and the Saturday mornings that had accumulated into the fabric of what their life had become simply present, occupying her specific position in the arrangement with the quiet confidence of a person who knows exactly where she belongs. She was wearing a dress she had chosen herself, dark blue, and she had strong opinions about the flowers that had been partially incorporated and partially not. And she had written a brief toast that she'd shown Grant 2 weeks before the wedding and that he had read with the particular vertigo of a parent seeing his child produce something that reveals how completely themselves they've become. The toast was 12 sentences. It was about what she had observed over the past 2 years, not the dramatic events, not the things that had happened in parking lots or warehouses or police station waiting rooms. The ordinary things. The way Grant's voice changed when he was paying attention to something. The way Cassandra crouched down to talk to her at 8 years old and gave her a real answer about corporate governance because she'd asked a real question. The farmer's market in January. The shared calendar. The argument about scheduling that lasted 20 minutes and ended with both of them fixing the actual problem. They're both very good at paying attention, Sadie wrote. I think that's why they found each other. And I think that's why it works. Grant had read this, standing in the kitchen while Sadie was at school, and had set it down on the counter and looked out the window for a moment at nothing in particular. He thought about what he had believed for a long time, about what he was for. Protection, vigilance, the maintenance of a perimeter that kept the people inside it safe. He had been good at this. He was still good at this. But he had believed underneath it that this was the complete definition, that the best thing he could offer the people he loved was the absence of threat, the management of danger, the steady watchfulness of someone whose job it is to stand between the vulnerable and the world. Cassandra had spent 5 months demonstrating, with the methodical patience of someone who does not accept incomplete evidence, that this was only part of the answer. The other part was harder and less familiar, the willingness to be known, the willingness to let someone stand beside you rather than always being the one standing in front, the willingness to accept that love is not a perimeter operation. You cannot protect a person into loving them. You cannot surveil someone into feeling safe. What you can do, if you are very careful and very honest and willing to stop managing the distance, is be present. Actually present. The way Sadie had seen it from the beginning and had been waiting, with the patience of someone who has understood what she was looking at for the adults to catch up. The ceremony was conducted by a civil officiant named Judge Eleanor Marsh, no relation. Coincidence of names acknowledged once by Cassandra with a flat look and never mentioned again, who had a clean, unhurried way of moving through the language that suited both of them. The vows were the traditional ones. Cassandra had asked whether Grant wanted to write personal vows, and Grant had said he wasn't sure he could write anything that would be more accurate than the existing ones, and Cassandra had said that was honest, and she felt the same way. And so they spoke the words that people have spoken in their many variations for a long time, the words about presence and commitment, and the particular forward motion of two people deciding to face the same direction. When Sadie delivered her toast, she did it with the focused seriousness she brought to everything that mattered to her. Her voice was steady and clear and entirely her own. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true is being said by someone who means it without reservation. At the end, she looked at Cassandra and then at Grant and said, "I'm glad you were at the wedding." The first one. There was a moment of laughter in the room, warm, genuine, the kind that comes from recognition rather than performance. Grant looked at his daughter, standing in her dark blue dress in the building where the skylight let in the April light, and felt the feeling that had no adequate name, the one that was not quite pride and not quite love in any simple form, but was the compound thing that happens when everything you have tried to build actually stands. He looked at Cassandra beside him. She was looking at Sadie with the expression that appeared when she was genuinely, privately happy, not the professional smile, not the careful competence, but the version of her that existed before the world required her to be anything in particular. She caught him looking and turned to meet his eyes. The April light came through the restored skylight, the same skylight they'd both looked up at on a dusty evening 2 years ago when neither of them had been willing to say what was already true, and it fell across the polished floors and the exposed timber beams and the 30 people who had shown up because they were the ones who actually counted. The officiant said the words that conclude these things. Grant said yes. Cassandra said yes. Sadie, standing beside them, said nothing, because she had already said what she had to say, and Sadie understood, better than most people twice her age, the difference between the moment that requires words and the moment that simply requires you to be in it. Later, months later then, years later, when people asked Cassandra how she and Grant had met, she always gave the same answer, delivered with the smile that changed her whole face. "He told me my dress was beautiful," she said. And Grant, if he was there, always said, "She knew I wasn't talking about the dress." And that was true, and it was enough, and it was the beginning of the whole thing, a man on a terrace at a summer wedding, watching someone he wasn't supposed to notice, lying to himself about it for approximately 4 minutes before he ran out of reasons to continue. What he had thought for most of his adult life was that the highest form of love was vigilance, the watching, the protection, the maintenance of safety for the people inside the circle he had drawn around them. He had been good at this, and it had cost him things he hadn't always acknowledged: the cost of the marriage, the years, the version of himself that might have been more present earlier if he had understood sooner that being present and being on watch are not the same operation. What Cassandra had shown him, not by telling him, not by asking him to change, but by being exactly herself for long enough that he could finally see it clearly, was that the people who love you are not always asking to be protected. Sometimes they are asking to be known, to be stood beside rather than stood in front of, to be trusted with their own strength rather than shielded from the fact that strength is required. He had spent years building walls out of competence and distance and the particular armor of a man who has been useful in extreme situations and has come to believe that utility is the primary thing he has to offer. It had taken a woman who was brilliant and infuriating and more self-sufficient than almost anyone he had ever met to demonstrate, by simply refusing to be protected into passivity, that the walls he had built were not keeping anything out. They were keeping him in. And the thing about walls, Grant had learned the thing that Cassandra had known from the moment she looked at him on that terrace and said, "You didn't mean the dress," is that they can come down. Not all at once, not without difficulty, not without the particular discomfort of discovering that you've been living in a smaller space than necessary. But they can come down. The skylight was intact. There was more room than he had thought. And the person standing beside him, with her hand in his, and the ring he had chosen with careful attention to everything he had observed about who she was, had known from the beginning that the door was not locked. She had just waited for him to try it,